Before we begin, if you're enjoying this content, please consider using your hype points on this video. It truly helps the channel more than you could possibly know. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review makes an enormous difference for us. And if you'd like, drop a comment letting us know what time it is and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from across the globe. If you enjoy these stories, please consider subscribing. It means everything. And a huge thank you to Justin for suggesting this topic. Now, imagine this. A desert landscape in New Mexico, December 1967. Deep beneath the sandstone and shale, technicians arm a nuclear warhead. Not for war, not for testing, but for energy, for progress, for the future of American industry. They detonate it. The earth shakes. Rock fractures for hundreds of feet in every direction. Natural gas begins flowing at rates never seen before. On paper, this experiment is a stunning success. But there's a problem. The gas is radioactive, unusable, unsellable, dangerous. Officials quietly shelve the project. They call it uneconomical. They say the technology simply wasn't practical. They move on. But what if that wasn't the whole truth? What if Project Gas Buggy worked exactly as planned, and that's precisely why it had to be buried? Tonight we're going underground, literally, into one of the strangest, most overlooked experiments of the Cold War. A moment when America decided to fracture the Earth itself with atomic fire, all in the name of progress. This is the story of the day we nuked the Earth for gas. Chapter 1. America's Nuclear Optimism. To understand Project Gas Buggy, you have to understand the era that birthed it. The 1960s, the height of the Cold War, a time when nuclear technology wasn't just accepted, it was celebrated. The Atomic Energy Commission, established in 1946, had become one of the most powerful agencies in the federal government. Its mission was sweeping: promote nuclear power, regulate nuclear materials, and explore every possible peaceful application of atomic energy. And they meant every possible application. This was the age of nuclear optimism, an age when engineers and politicians genuinely believed that splitting the atom could solve nearly any problem. Power shortages, nuclear reactors, transportation, nuclear-powered ships, trains, even cars were proposed. Construction projects? Why not use nuclear explosions to carve out harbours and canals? The proposals that came across desks at the Atomic Energy Commission during this period read like science fiction. Nuclear-powered aircraft that could stay aloft for months, atomic batteries small enough to power pacemakers, reactors on the moon to support lunar colonies, underground cities heated by nuclear furnaces. None of these ideas seemed absurd at the time. They seemed inevitable. Popular magazines featured glossy illustrations of the atomic future. Families living in climate-controlled nuclear homes, farmers using nuclear explosives to create instant irrigation reservoirs, ships crossing oceans powered by reactors smaller than a car engine. The atom was going to remake civilization itself. This optimism was carefully cultivated. The Atomic Energy Commission invested heavily in public relations. They produced films, sponsored exhibitions, sent speakers to schools and community centres. The message was always the same. Nuclear energy was safe, clean, the power source of tomorrow. The word atomic carried an almost magical quality. Atomic clocks measured time with unprecedented precision. Atomic medicine promised new cancer treatments. Atomic research was pushing the boundaries of human knowledge. It represented humanity's triumph over nature itself, our ability to harness the fundamental forces of the universe. Underground nuclear testing had become routine by the early 60s. The technology was proven, the infrastructure was in place. Scientists understood blast mechanics, yield calculations, seismic effects. Hundreds of devices had been detonated beneath the Nevada desert. Each test refined the understanding of how nuclear weapons behaved underground. So the question became increasingly obvious to planners and engineers. Why limit nuclear detonations to weapons testing? Why not put that power to work? The explosions were happening anyway. The expertise existed. The facilities were built. All that was needed was a new application, a peaceful purpose. The idea seemed not just logical but morally imperative. America had developed nuclear weapons, used them in war, built an arsenal capable of destroying civilization. Now it was time to prove that the atom could build as well as destroy, that the same technology that ended the Second World War could power the future. It was an era of unshakable confidence, an era when the government assured citizens that radiation exposure could be managed, that contamination could be contained, that any risks were acceptable when weighed against progress, that science had advanced to the point where nuclear energy was no more dangerous than any other industrial process. The public largely believed these assurances. Trust in government expertise was high. The generation that had won a world war and was landing men on the moon seemed capable of anything. If scientists said nuclear explosions could be made safe and useful, who was the average citizen to argue? There were dissenting voices, scientists who questioned whether the risks were truly understood, activists who warned about radiation exposure, communities downwind from test sites who reported unusual illnesses. But these voices were marginalised, dismissed as alarmist, accused of being anti-progress or even un-American during the height of Cold War tensions. The institutional momentum was overwhelming. The Atomic Energy Commission had billions in funding, thousands of employees, contracts with major corporations, political support from both parties. The infrastructure of nuclear optimism was too large, too entrenched to be easily questioned. And so, within this atmosphere of atomic ambition and institutional confidence, a program was born. A program that would attempt to prove that nuclear weapons could be tools of peace, tools of industry, tools of the future. They called it Project Plowshare. The name itself was marketing genius. Chapter 2. Project Plowshare. The biblical reference was deliberate. They shall beat their swords into plowshares, weapons transformed into instruments of growth and prosperity. It captured perfectly what the Atomic Energy Commission wanted the public to believe, that America's nuclear arsenal could be reimagined, repurposed, made peaceful. Project Plowshare officially launched in June 1957 under the direction of the Lawrence Radiation Laboratory, which later became Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. The concept was straightforward in theory. Use nuclear explosives for large-scale civil engineering and resource extraction. The military had perfected the destruction. Now it was time to perfect the construction. The man most associated with Plowshare in its early years was Edward Teller, the physicist often called the father of the hydrogen bomb. Teller was a true believer in peaceful nuclear applications. He envisioned a world where nuclear explosives would be as common a tool as dynamite, where construction crews would routinely use small nuclear devices to blast through mountains or excavate foundations. In speeches and interviews, Teller painted vivid pictures of this atomic future. A new Panama Canal carved in months rather than years using a series of nuclear detonations. An artificial harbour in Alaska opening up new shipping routes. Highways cut through mountain ranges in days, the entire landscape of human civilization remade by peaceful atomic power. The proposed applications were wildly ambitious, creating artificial harbours by detonating nuclear devices along coastlines, carving canals through mountain ranges to redirect rivers, excavating massive reservoirs to irrigate desert regions, breaking up ore deposits deep underground to facilitate mining, and most relevant to our story, stimulating natural gas and oil production by fracturing rock formations that conventional drilling couldn't access. Early experiments were conducted to test these concepts. In July 1962, Project Sedan detonated a nuclear device in the Nevada desert. The explosion created a crater over 300 feet deep and nearly 1,300 feet wide. 12 million tons of earth were displaced in a fraction of a second. The blast was visible for miles. The dust cloud rose thousands of feet into the air. Officials called it a demonstration of nuclear excavation potential. Newsreels showed the massive crater. Engineers explained how dozens of similar blasts could create a sea-level canal across Central America as an alternative to the Panama Canal. The footage was impressive. The implications seemed limitless. But there were problems even then. The Sudan blast released more radiation into the atmosphere than expected. Fallout drifted far beyond the intended zone. Monitoring stations detected elevated readings across multiple states. The Atomic Energy Commission assured the public the exposure was minimal and within safe limits, but the incident planted seeds of doubt. Project Gnome, detonated in December 1961 near Carlsbad, New Mexico, was designed to demonstrate that nuclear heat could be captured and converted to electricity. The device was placed in a salt formation, where the explosion would create a cavity filled with superheated steam. Engineers planned to tap this steam to drive turbines. The test did not go as planned. The explosion vented to the surface, releasing a plume of radioactive steam into the atmosphere. Local residents watched the unexpected cloud rise from the desert. Once again, officials insisted there was no danger. Once again, trust eroded slightly. These setbacks didn't stop Plowshare. They led to refinements, better containment strategies, more careful site selection, more sophisticated modelling. The programme pressed forward with dozens of proposed applications under consideration. But behind the optimistic public messaging, questions were already forming among some scientists and engineers. Radiation releases from tests exceeded predictions more often than acknowledged. Seismic effects were harder to control than anticipated. The political complications of detonating nuclear devices on civilian land were becoming apparent. There were also economic questions. Nuclear excavation sounded efficient in theory, but the actual costs were substantial. Each device required extensive preparation, safety measures, environmental monitoring, liability insurance. When all factors were considered, conventional methods often proved cheaper and more predictable. Still, the Atomic Energy Commission continued to promote Plowshare, because this wasn't just about engineering anymore. It was about ideology, about demonstrating that America's nuclear arsenal could be reimagined, about proving to the world and to domestic critics that nuclear weapons technology had peaceful applications, about justifying the enormous investment in nuclear infrastructure. The program needed a success, something that would demonstrate clear commercial viability, something that would silence the doubters and prove that Plowshare was more than atomic fantasy. Natural gas extraction seemed like the perfect proving ground. The United States had vast natural gas reserves locked in deep, tight rock formations throughout the western states. Conventional drilling could only access a fraction of these resources. The rock was too dense, the gas too dispersed, the permeability too low. Energy companies had identified these formations decades earlier, but lacked technology to extract the gas economically. But what if a nuclear explosion could fracture that rock, create pathways for the gas to flow, unlock energy reserves that would otherwise remain untapped for generations? The concept was elegant, simple, and potentially revolutionary for the energy industry. The economic implications were staggering. If nuclear stimulation worked, it could multiply America's accessible natural gas reserves many times over. It would reduce dependence on foreign oil, lower energy costs, power economic growth, and prove that Plowshare was a practical program, not just a publicity stunt. The concept was called nuclear stimulation, and it required a test site, somewhere remote enough to minimize public concern, somewhere with known gas deposits to measure results, somewhere with geology suitable for an underground detonation, somewhere where questions would be few and oversight would be limited. The search focused on the western states, where vast federal lands offered potential sites far from major population centres. Geological surveys were conducted, energy companies were consulted, political considerations were weighed. They found their location in the high desert of northwestern New Mexico, a place most Americans had never heard of, a place that would soon become the site of one of the strangest experiments in American history. They called it Project Gas Buggy. Chapter 3. Choosing the Site. Farmington, New Mexico sits in the northwest corner of the state, where desert plateaus meet the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. In the 1960s, it was a small community of around 20,000 people. Mining and energy extraction formed the economic backbone. Uranium had been discovered in the region in the 50s. Oil and gas wells dotted the landscape. It was a place where people understood that the earth beneath their feet held valuable resources. The town itself had a frontier quality despite being well into the 20th century. Wide streets, low buildings, a landscape dominated by the horizontal rather than the vertical. The Animas River ran through town, providing a thin ribbon of green in an otherwise arid environment. Beyond the city limits, the land opened up into classic high desert, mesas rising from flat plains, canyons carved by ancient water, vegetation limited to hardy shrubs and scattered juniper trees. The sky here is immense. At night, without city lights to compete, the stars seem close enough to touch. It's the kind of place where you can see weather systems approaching from 50 miles away, where the curvature of the earth becomes almost visible on the horizon, where human presence feels temporary against the permanence of geological time. Beneath this landscape lay the San Juan Basin, one of the richest natural gas fields in North America. Geologists had mapped it extensively since the early 20th century. The basin stretched across northwestern New Mexico and southwestern Colorado, covering thousands of square miles. Multiple rock formations at various depths contained natural gas, formed over millions of years from organic material buried and compressed by overlying sediments. Energy companies had been extracting gas from conventional wells in the basin since the 1920s. The productive zones were well understood. Wells could be drilled to specific depths to tap into permeable sandstone formations, where gas had accumulated in extractable quantities. The San Juan Basin was proven, reliable, a known commodity in the energy industry. But geologists also knew that much more gas existed in the basin than could be extracted conventionally. Tight sandstone formations held vast reserves. The rock was too dense, the pores too small, the permeability too low. Gas was present but couldn't flow to wells at economically viable rates. This stranded gas represented a tantalizing target. Billions of cubic feet of energy that technology couldn't yet access. This made the San Juan Basin ideal for testing nuclear stimulation. The geology was thoroughly documented. The presence of gas was confirmed. Conventional wells already existed for comparison, and the region was remote enough to minimize public relations challenges. The Atomic Energy Commission worked with the Bureau of Mines and private energy companies to select a specific location. The site chosen was approximately 50 miles southeast of Farmington, deep in Rio Arriba County. The land was leased from the El Paso Natural Gas Company, which held extraction rights throughout the region. The specific coordinates put the site in terrain that few locals ever visited. No towns nearby, no major roads, no permanent structures, just miles of high desert rolling toward distant mesas. The kind of landscape that looks empty but isn't. Ravens circle overhead, lizards dart between rocks, coyotes leave tracks in the dust, but human presence is minimal. This remoteness was not accidental. It was essential to the project's success. Rural communities have always been preferred locations for experiments that carry risk. The pattern is consistent throughout American history. Nuclear weapons testing concentrated in Nevada deserts and Pacific Islands. Toxic waste facilities sited in isolated counters. Industrial experiments conducted far from major population centres. The logic is simple. Fewer people means fewer complaints, less media attention, less political pressure, less chance of organised opposition. There's also a demographic component that's rarely discussed openly. Rural communities often lack the political and economic resources to resist unwanted projects. They have smaller tax bases, less access to legal expertise, fewer connections to state and federal power structures. When controversial projects are proposed, these communities face an uphill battle in mounting effective opposition. Additionally, rural economies often depend on natural resource extraction, mining, drilling, logging, agriculture. The presence of energy companies and federal agencies is normalised. When those same entities propose new projects, there's often institutional support from local officials who view it as economic development, jobs, revenue, activity in regions where economic opportunities are limited. The residents near the gas buggy site fit this pattern. Many worked in energy extraction or related industries. They understood drilling operations. had seen oil and gas wells their entire lives, were accustomed to industrial activity in the landscape. When officials arrived to explain that a nuclear device would be detonated underground to stimulate gas production, it wasn't entirely outside their frame of reference. Public meetings were held in Farmington in the months leading up to the test. Officials from the Atomic Energy Commission, the Bureau of Mines, and El Paso Natural Gas presented the project. They emphasized the scientific nature of the experiment, the careful planning, the safety measures, the monitoring systems that would track every aspect of the detonation and its aftermath. The presentation was professional, reassuring, technical enough to convey expertise but accessible enough for a general audience. Charts showed the proposed drilling depth. Diagrams illustrated how the explosion would fracture rock. Calculations demonstrated that radiation would be contained thousands of feet underground, far from the surface, far from water supplies, far from any possible human exposure. Most attendees accepted these assurances. This was 1967. The government had enormous credibility. The space program was racing toward the moon. Technology seemed capable of almost anything. If scientists said an underground nuclear detonation could be conducted safely, most people believed them. There were questions, of course. What about radiation? What about groundwater? What about long-term effects? What about seismic damage to buildings? The officials had prepared answers. Radiation would remain confined to the blast zone. Groundwater sources were far removed from the detonation depth. Long-term effects had been studied extensively through hundreds of underground tests in Nevada. Seismic effects would be minimal, equivalent to a small earthquake that occurs naturally in the region. A few residents remained skeptical. They wanted independent verification. They wanted guarantees. They wanted to know what would happen if something went wrong. But their concerns were individual voices, not organised opposition. And in a community where economic development was valued and trust in government expertise was high, those voices were easily marginalised. There was also the appeal of being part of history. Project Gas Buggy was presented as cutting-edge science. Demonstration project that could revolutionise energy extraction. The first application of peaceful nuclear technology for natural gas production. Farmington and Rio Arriba County were going to be part of something important. Something that textbooks would mention, something that proved American innovation could solve the energy challenges of the future. This narrative was compelling. Rural communities often feel overlooked by the broader culture. Being selected as the site for a significant scientific experiment carried a certain prestige. It suggested that this place mattered, that it was contributing to national progress. The legal framework was established without significant challenge. Permits were secured from state and federal agencies. Environmental assessments, such as they were in that era, were completed. Liability agreements were signed. Insurance was arranged. The project moved forward on schedule. Equipment began arriving at the site in the summer of 1967. The drill rig was transported in pieces and assembled on location. Support structures were erected. Monitoring equipment was installed at various distances from the planned detonation point. Technicians and engineers took up temporary residence in Farmington, filling motel rooms and patronising local restaurants. The drilling began. Day after day, the bit cut deeper into the earth, through layers of sandstone laid down when ancient seas covered this region, through shale formed from compressed mud, through coal seams created from primordial swamps. Each layer told a story of geological time, of environments that existed millions of years before humans walked the earth. The target depth was over 4,000 feet, deeper than most wells in the region. The drill had to penetrate through the conventional gas-producing zones and reach the tight sandstone formations that conventional technology couldn't exploit. The rock samples brought to the surface were analysed. Core samples were examined. The drilling continued. Finally, in late November, the drill reached the target depth. The hole was prepared, casing was installed, the shaft was ready to receive the nuclear device that would soon change this landscape forever. On the surface, the site looked unremarkable. A drilling rig, some temporary structures, equipment, workers. It could have been any oil or gas operation in the southwest. But deep below, In a shaft descending more than 4,000 feet into ancient rock, preparations were underway for something unprecedented. A nuclear weapon was being lowered into the earth not to destroy, but to create, to fracture, to stimulate, to prove that the atom could serve industry as readily as it had served war. December 10th was chosen as the detonation date. A clear day in the high desert. Perfect conditions for monitoring. Perfect conditions for making history. Chapter 4. The Detonation. The morning of December 10th, 1967 dawned, cold and clear across northwestern New Mexico. Temperatures hovered just above freezing. The sky was cloudless, that deep blue unique to high altitude and low humidity. The kind of day where you can see for 100 miles in every direction, where the air is so transparent that distant mountains look closer than they are. At the gas buggy site, final preparations had been underway for days. The nuclear device had been lowered into position at the bottom of the shaft, a modified atomic warhead designed specifically for underground detonation. The yield was calculated at 29 kilotons of TNT equivalent. To put that in perspective, the bomb dropped on Hiroshima in 1945 was approximately 15 kilotons. This device was nearly twice as powerful. But this wasn't a weapon of war. The engineers would insist on that distinction. This was a tool, an industrial instrument designed to fracture rock in ways that conventional explosives never could. The physics were the same as a weapon, but the purpose was different. That distinction mattered immensely to the people managing the project. The device sat at a depth of 4,240 feet, nestled in the pictured cliff sandstone formation. This layer was known to contain natural gas, but the rock was too tight for conventional extraction. Porosity was low, permeability was minimal. Wells drilled into this formation produced only small amounts of gas, not enough to justify the drilling costs. The theory behind nuclear stimulation was elegant in its simplicity. A nuclear explosion releases an enormous amount of energy in a fraction of a second. At ground zero, temperatures reach millions of degrees. Matter is vaporized instantly. A cavity forms where solid rock simply ceases to exist, transformed into vapor and plasma. Beyond the immediate vaporization zone, the shockwave propagates outward at supersonic speeds. This shockwave crushes and fractures rock for hundreds of feet in every direction. The force is incomprehensible. Rock that has sat undisturbed for millions of years is suddenly subjected to pressures that exceed anything in normal geological processes. These fractures create new pathways through the rock. Natural gas trapped in tiny pores suddenly has routes to migrate. Instead of seeping molecule by molecule through minuscule openings, the gas can flow through newly created fissures. Flow rates increase dramatically. Wells that would have produced trickles suddenly produce substantial volumes. That was the theory. And on paper, the mathematics worked perfectly. Engineers had modelled the blast extensively. They calculated the cavity size based on the device yield and rock properties. They estimated fracture radius using data from hundreds of previous underground tests. They predicted gas flow increases based on permeability changes. Every variable had been accounted for in complex computer models. Seismic monitoring stations were established at the various distances from the site. Instruments would measure the ground motion, record the shock wave propagation, document how the explosion's energy moved through the earth. This data would be valuable for future tests and for understanding underground blast mechanics. Radiation monitoring equipment was positioned both at the site and in surrounding communities. Air samplers, water samplers, soil collectors. Every possible pathway for radiation exposure would be tracked. The Atomic Energy Commission was determined to demonstrate that the detonation posed no risk to public safety. In Farmington, residents had been notified of the test. Local newspapers ran articles explaining what would happen. Officials assured everyone that the explosion was deep enough and contained enough that surface effects would be minimal. People might feel their houses shake slightly, windows might rattle. But there was no danger, no need for evacuation, no need for alarm. Many residents planned to be home, to experience it, to feel the earth move beneath their feet, to be part of history, even if just as witnesses to a distant tremor. At the site, technicians made final checks. Communication systems were tested. Monitoring equipment was verified operational. Countdown procedures were reviewed. Everything had to be perfect. This wasn't just a test. It was a demonstration project with enormous implications for the future of nuclear stimulation and the broader Plowshare program. The device was armed remotely. The shaft had been filled and sealed. A concrete plug at the surface was designed to contain any possible venting of radioactive material. Multiple backup systems ensured that if something went wrong, the radiation would stay underground. The countdown began. 10 minutes to detonation. 5 minutes. 1 minute. The final seconds ticked away in the control room, where engineers monitored readouts and instruments. 0. 4,000 feet below the surface, the nuclear device. Initiated. In a billionth of a second, the chain reaction began. Neutrons collided with uranium atoms. Atoms split. Released energy. Released more neutrons. The cascade accelerated at nearly the speed of light. The rock vaporized. A cavity formed. The temperature at the center exceeded that of the sun's surface. Gases expanded violently. The shockwave radiated outward in a perfect sphere, crushing everything in its path. On the surface, the ground heaved. A seismic wave propagated in all directions. The monitoring instruments registered the peak instantly. A magnitude 4 earthquake. Significant, but not catastrophic. In Farmington, 50 miles away, residents felt their buildings shake. Pictures rattled on walls. Dishes clinked in cupboards. Dogs barked. Children ran outside, excited and frightened. The tremor lasted only seconds. Then stillness returned. At the site, engineers waited, watched their instruments, monitored for any sign of venting. The concrete plug held. No, radiation escaped to the surface. The containment had worked exactly as designed. Underground, the blast had created a cavity estimated at 70 feet in diameter. The surrounding rock was fractured for hundreds of feet in every direction. Millions of tons of stone had been permanently altered. Pathways that didn't exist before now connected previously isolated gas pockets. In the immediate aftermath, there was relief. The test had been successful from a technical standpoint. The device had detonated as planned. The yield was within expected ranges. Containment had worked. Seismic effects had been predicted accurately. No injuries, no accidents, no radiation releases. Press releases went out within hours. The Atomic Energy Commission declared Project Gasbuggy a success, a demonstration that nuclear stimulation could work, that Plowshare had real applications, that the atom could serve peaceful purposes. In the days following the blast, engineers began the next phase. They drilled new wells into the fractured zone, completed the wells, prepared to extract gas and measure the flow rates. This was the moment of truth. Did the nuclear explosion actually improve gas production? Or had it just created an expensive radioactive cavity? Initial results were promising. Gas flowed from the fractured zone at rates significantly higher than conventional wells in the same formation. The explosion had worked. The rock had been fractured. The permeability had increased. On every technical metric, the experiment was a success. Champagne corks popped in offices in Washington and at Lawrence Livermore Laboratory. Engineers celebrated. Plans were drafted for additional tests. The energy industry took notice. If nuclear stimulation could be proven commercially viable, it would transform natural gas extraction throughout the western United States. But then the samples came back from the laboratory, and the celebration stopped. Chapter 5. The problem nobody wanted, the first. Indication came from routine analysis of the gas samples extracted from the fractured zone. Standard procedure required testing for composition and quality. The engineers expected mostly methane, the primary component of natural gas, along with small amounts of other hydrocarbons and inert gases. What they didn't expect was what the instruments detected. The gas was radioactive, not slightly radioactive, not marginally above background, but contaminated to a degree that made it completely unusable for any commercial application. The primary contaminant was tritium, a radioactive isotope of hydrogen. In a nuclear explosion, tritium is produced as a byproduct of the fusion reaction. Some tritium is incorporated into the device itself as a booster to enhance the yield. When the device detonates, that tritium is released into the surrounding environment. Tritium has a half-life of approximately 12 years. This means that after 12 years, half of the tritium will have decayed into helium. After another 12 years, half of what remains will decay. The process continues exponentially. While tritium is not the most dangerous radioactive isotope, it presents significant problems for natural gas distribution. When tritium combines with oxygen, it forms tritiated water. When it combines with carbon, it can become part of hydrocarbon molecules. In the case of gas buggy, tritium had bonded with the natural gas itself. The methane molecules contain tritium atoms instead of normal hydrogen atoms. This contamination was molecular. It couldn't be filtered out by conventional processing. The levels detected in the gas buggy gas samples were extraordinary, hundreds of times higher than any allowable limit for commercial gas distribution. If this gas were delivered to homes and businesses, if people used it for heating and cooking, they would be exposed to radioactive contamination in their own houses. But tritium wasn't the only problem. The analysis also detected krypton-85, another radioactive isotope produced in nuclear fission. Krypton-85 has a half-life of about 10 years and is a noble gas, meaning it doesn't readily react with other elements. It would remain in the gas stream and be released into the atmosphere whenever the gas was burned. There was radioactive carbon-14 as well. With a half-life of over 5,000 years, carbon-14 would be a persistent contaminant for generations, and trace amounts of other isotopes, each with its own decay characteristics and health implications. The engineers had anticipated some radioactive contamination. Underground nuclear tests always produce isotopes. But the assumption had been that these would remain in the blast cavity, trapped in the melted rock or dispersed at concentrations low enough to be managed. The reality was different. The gas flowing through the fractures was picking up contamination and carrying it into the production zone. This created an impossible problem for Project Gas Buggy and the entire concept of nuclear stimulation. The experiment had been designed to prove commercial viability, to show that nuclear explosions could unlock stranded gas reserves economically. But if the gas extracted was too radioactive to sell, the entire premise collapsed. You couldn't market radioactive natural gas. No utility company would accept it. No regulatory agency would approve it. No customer would want it flowing through pipes into their homes. The gas was worthless. Worse than worthless, actually, because it was now a disposal problem. The economic calculations that had justified the project suddenly looked very different. Without revenue from gas sales, the costs couldn't be recovered. The expensive drilling, the device itself, the monitoring, the infrastructure, all of it now represented a loss with no return. Nuclear stimulation wasn't just impractical, it was fundamentally flawed. But admitting this publicly posed enormous problems. Project Gas Buggy had been promoted as a demonstration of peaceful nuclear technology. Press releases had declared it a success. The Atomic Energy Commission had built expectations that nuclear stimulation could revolutionize energy extraction. Acknowledging that the gas was unusable would undermine everything Plowshare was trying to prove. There were also broader implications. If nuclear stimulation contaminated resources, what did that say about other Plowshare applications? If you couldn't safely extract gas, could you safely create harbours, dig canals, excavate reservoirs? The contamination problem raised fundamental questions about whether peaceful nuclear explosions were viable at all. Officials faced a decision: tell the truth and face the consequences, or reframe the failure in terms that preserved the broader program. They chose the latter. In official reports and public statements, Project Gas Buggy was described as technically successful but economically impractical. The language was carefully crafted. Yes, the explosion had fractured the rock. Yes, gas flow had increased. But the costs of nuclear stimulation exceeded the value of the gas produced. Therefore, the technique was not commercially viable at current gas prices. This explanation was technically true. The radioactive gas couldn't be sold, which meant there was no economic return. But it framed the failure as a matter of cost-benefit analysis, rather than safety and contamination. It suggested that perhaps with higher gas prices or lower detonation costs, nuclear stimulation might become viable in the future. The contamination issue was acknowledged but minimised. Reports mentioned that some radioactive isotopes were present in the gas, but emphasised that this was expected and manageable. The gas was described as unsuitable for immediate commercial use, but the implication was that this was a technical hurdle to overcome, not a fundamental flaw in the concept. This messaging strategy served multiple purposes. It protected the Ploughshare program from criticism. It maintained the fiction that peaceful nuclear applications were viable. It avoided liability questions about deliberately contaminating natural resources, and it prevented panic among communities near the test site. But it also meant that the full truth about Project Gasbuggy never entered public consciousness. The experiment was remembered, if at all, as an interesting but impractical idea from an era of atomic optimism. Not as a demonstration that nuclear weapons contaminate whatever they touch. Not as proof that some technologies have consequences that outweigh their benefits. The site remained active for several more years. Engineers continued monitoring the gas, studying the isotope levels, watching how the contamination evolved over time. The hope was that radioactivity would decrease as isotopes decayed and gas from uncontaminated zones migrated into the fractured area, diluting the contamination. But the tritium levels remained high. The gas remained unusable, and slowly, quietly, the project was wound down. Funding decreased. Personnel were reassigned. Monitoring became less frequent. The wells were eventually sealed. The site was decommissioned. By 1973, Project Gasbuggy was officially closed. The experiment had demonstrated that you could fracture rock with a nuclear explosion, that gas flow could be increased, that the technical objectives were achievable. But it had also demonstrated something officials preferred not to emphasise, that nuclear contamination is not easily contained, that radioactive isotopes persist for decades, that some experiments leave consequences that cannot be undone. The radioactivity didn't disappear. The tritium continued its slow decay. The contaminated rock remained thousands of feet underground. The isotopes worked their way through fractures according to the laws of physics and chemistry, indifferent to human intentions or regrets. And above ground, officials moved on to the next project, the next test, the next attempt to prove that nuclear weapons could be made peaceful. Chapter 6. Reassurance to the public. The morning after the detonation, headlines in the Farmington Daily Times declared the test a success. The article quoted officials describing how the experiment had gone exactly as planned. The explosion was contained. No radiation reached the surface. Seismic effects were minimal and within predicted ranges. Project Gasbuggy represented a significant achievement in peaceful nuclear technology. Residents who had felt their houses shake the previous afternoon read these assurances with relief. The ground had moved beneath their feet, but apparently everything was fine. The scientists knew what they were doing. The technology was under control. In the days and weeks following the blast, the Atomic Energy Commission moved aggressively to reinforce this message. Press, conferences were held. Technical reports were released. Monitoring data was made public. The narrative was consistent across every channel. The radiation was contained deep underground. The site was safe. There was no danger to nearby communities. Seismic monitoring had confirmed that the blast had been entirely subsurface. The concrete plug at the top of the shaft had held. No venting had occurred. The explosion's energy had been directed exactly where engineers intended, fracturing rock thousands of feet below ground while leaving the surface undisturbed, except for the predicted earthquake-like tremor. Radiation monitoring stations positioned throughout the region reported normal background readings. Air samples collected in Farmington and surrounding communities showed no elevated levels of any radioactive isotopes. The sensitive instruments detected nothing out of the ordinary. The radiation, officials emphasized, had remained exactly where it was supposed to be. Underground. Confined. Contained. Water testing received particular attention because groundwater contamination was one of the public's primary concerns. Wells throughout Rio Arriba County were sampled in the weeks following the detonation. The results showed no contamination, no tritium, no unusual isotopes. no indication that radioactive material had migrated from the blast zone into aquifers. These findings were published in technical reports and summarised in press releases. Officials pointed to the depth of the detonation as a key safety factor. At more than 4,000 feet down, the explosion occurred far below the water-bearing formations that supplied drinking water to the region. Multiple layers of impermeable rock separated the blast zone from aquifers. The geology itself provided containment. Livestock in the area appeared unaffected. Ranchers reported no unusual deaths or illnesses among cattle, sheep, or horses. Crops grew normally in the following spring. The land showed no visible signs of contamination. Life continued as it had before December 10th, 1967. The Atomic Energy Commission published comprehensive technical reports detailing every aspect of the monitoring program. These documents were hundreds of pages long, filled with tables of data, charts showing radiation readings, maps of monitoring station locations, and analyses of seismic recordings. The reports projected an image of thoroughness and scientific rigour. For anyone willing to read through the technical language and complex data presentations, the message was clear. Project Gas Buggy had been monitored with extraordinary care. Every possible exposure pathway had been evaluated. Every potential risk had been assessed. The conclusion was unambiguous. The test posed no threat to public health or environmental safety. Local officials amplified these federal assurances. County commissioners told concerned residents that experts had reviewed the data and found no cause for alarm. The mayor of Farmington gave interviews emphasising that the community was perfectly safe. Chamber of Commerce representatives pointed out that the test demonstrated that sophisticated scientific operations could be conducted in the region, potentially attracting more high-tech industry. Newspaper editorials praised Project Gas Buggy as an example of American innovation. The experiment showed that New Mexico was at the forefront of energy technology, that the state was contributing to national energy security, that rural communities could host cutting-edge scientific research. The tone was optimistic, forward-looking, proud. For most people, this multi-layered reassurance campaign was effective. The government had tested extensively. Experts had analysed the data. Officials had declared everything safe. Who was the average citizen to question that? Trusting authority was the norm in that era. Skepticism of government scientific programs was not yet widespread, but there were always a few who remained uneasy, who noticed that monitoring stations were gradually removed over the following years, who wondered why follow-up studies weren't more comprehensive, who questioned whether a few months of monitoring could really assess risks that might take years or decades to manifest. These concerns were expressed quietly, usually in private conversations rather than public forums. Someone might mention to a neighbour that they wondered about long-term effects. A rancher might tell friends that he wasn't entirely convinced the experts knew everything. A mother might confide that she worried about raising children near a site where a nuclear device had been exploded. These private doubts were never organised into effective opposition or demands for more investigation. The concerns remained individual, fragmented, easy to dismiss as natural anxiety rather than legitimate scientific questioning. The Atomic Energy Commission had learned valuable lessons from previous nuclear tests about managing public perception. They understood that people needed reassurance, that technical data needed to be presented in accessible ways, that local officials were crucial allies in maintaining trust. The communication strategy around Gas Buggy reflected this institutional knowledge. But there was something else at work too, something less cynical than deliberate deception, but perhaps more insidious. A genuine belief among many officials and scientists that they understood the risks better than they actually did, that their models were more complete than they were, that their monitoring was more comprehensive than it could be given practical limitations. This certainty, this confidence in technical expertise created a kind of blind spot. Questions that should have been explored more deeply were dismissed as answered. Uncertainties that should have prompted caution were treated as negligible. The culture of nuclear optimism that had given birth to Project Plowshare in the first place made it difficult for people within that culture to recognise its limitations. The site itself became a kind of monument to this dynamic, fenced but not heavily secured, marked but not prominently. The message conveyed by its appearance was that this was not a dangerous place requiring extreme caution. Just another closed industrial site in a landscape dotted with abandoned mines and sealed wells. No dramatic warning signs, no extensive exclusion zones, no armed guards or multiple security perimeters. The low-key approach served a communicative purpose. Heavy security suggests danger. Minimal security suggests there's nothing to worry about. By treating the gas buggy site as unremarkable, officials reinforced their message that the detonation posed no ongoing threat. Years passed. The initial media attention faded. Project Gas Buggy stopped being news and became history. The Atomic Energy Commission was eventually dissolved and its responsibilities divided among new agencies, including the Department of Energy. Personnel turned over. Institutional memory of the specific details became fuzzy. The monitoring continued for a time, but gradually decreased in scope and frequency. Annual reports became less detailed. Budget allocations for gas buggy-related activities shrank. The site became just one more entry in the Department of Energy's vast portfolio of closed nuclear locations. But the isotopes didn't fade as quickly as the memory. Tritium continued its 12-year half-life decay. Other contaminants followed their own schedules. The fractured rock still bore the signature of that December afternoon, when nuclear fire had transformed it. The cavity still existed in the darkness thousands of feet down, and the communities that had been promised safety, that had been assured nothing was wrong, simply went about their lives. Most never thought about Project Gas Buggy. It became an obscure footnote, a story some older residents might mention occasionally. Something that happened once, long ago, in a different era. But for those who remembered, for those who had felt the earth shake that December day, questions lingered at the edges of consciousness. Questions that were never quite answered, concerns that were never quite dismissed, a vague unease that maybe, just maybe, they hadn't been told everything there was to know. Chapter 7. The Local Stories. Maria Gutierrez was 24 years old when the ground shook. She was hanging laundry in the backyard of her home on the outskirts of Farmington. The day was clear and cold. Her daughter, 3 years old, played nearby with a toy truck in the dirt. When the tremor hit, Maria felt it through her feet first, a sensation like someone had struck the earth with a massive hammer. The clothesline swayed. The house groaned. Her daughter looked up, confused and frightened by the strange sensation. It lasted only seconds. Then stillness returned. Maria picked up her daughter and went inside. Her husband, a driller for one of the local gas companies, had told her about the test, had explained that there might be shaking, had assured her it was safe. 20 years later, in an interview conducted by a graduate student researching Project Gas Buggy, Maria would describe a different memory. A pattern she hadn't noticed at the time, but that emerged slowly over the years. Neighbours developed cancers that seemed unusually common, thyroid conditions, respiratory problems. Nothing that could be proven, nothing definitive, but enough to make her wonder. Her own daughter struggled with health issues in adolescence that doctors couldn't quite explain. Fatigue, joint pain, difficulties that came and went without clear cause. Was it related to Gas Buggy? Impossible to say. But Maria couldn't help wondering if that moment when she felt the earth shake had been the beginning of something her family would deal with for decades. These stories exist in fragments, interviews conducted by researchers, oral histories collected by local historical societies, conversations recorded by journalists investigating Cold War nuclear programs. They don't form a clear pattern, they don't prove causation, but they accumulate into a collective unease. Robert Chen moved to the area in 1972, 5 years after the detonation, to take a job with a mining company. He bought a ranch about 30 miles from the gas buggy site, raised cattle, built a life in the high desert. Had never heard of Project Gas Buggy when he arrived. Years later, in the mid-1980s, Robert started having problems with his well water. It tasted strange, slightly metallic. Chemical testing found nothing alarming, but the taste persisted. He drilled a new well in a different location on his property. The water was better. When he finally learned about Gasbuggy, learned that a nuclear device had been detonated not far from his land, he wondered if there was a connection. Had contamination migrated through underground fractures? Was the water table affected? He contacted state agencies asking for more thorough testing. The responses were polite but dismissive. His well was far from the site. The geology didn't support migration of contamination over such distances. He was worrying unnecessarily. But Robert couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That official assurances were too confident given how little long-term monitoring had actually been done. That the absence of evidence was being treated as evidence of absence. These individual stories never coalesced into a movement or organised opposition. The people involved were scattered across a rural landscape. Communication was limited. Concerns remained local and personal rather than collective and political. Without scientific studies showing elevated illness rates or contamination, there was no leverage to demand investigation. There were also practical barriers to organising. Rural communities are spread out. People work long hours in physically demanding jobs. Organising requires time, resources and expertise that most residents simply didn't have. Fighting federal agencies and energy companies requires lawyers, scientists and political connections. None of that was readily available to ranchers and small-town families in northwestern New Mexico. Additionally, there was social pressure not to complain too loudly. Farmington's economy depended on energy extraction. Many families had members working in drilling, mining or related industries. Criticising nuclear programs or raising environmental concerns could be seen as anti-development, as threatening the economic base that sustained the community. This created a culture of quiet accommodation. People might have private doubts but rarely voiced them publicly. Questions were asked in living rooms, not at town meetings. Concerns were shared with friends and family, not broadcast to wider audiences. Thomas Begay, a Navajo rancher whose family had grazed sheep in the region for generations, noticed changes in the years after Gasbuggy. Not dramatic changes, not things you could point to definitively, but subtle shifts that accumulated over time. Some of his sheep developed health problems that were difficult to diagnose. Lambing success rates seemed to decline. These are things that fluctuate naturally in ranching. Weather, forage quality, disease. It's almost impossible to attribute specific outcomes to specific causes when dealing with livestock. But Thomas remembered the promises made before the detonation, that the test would be completely safe, that nothing would change, that the land would be unaffected. Looking at his struggling flock years later, he felt those promises had been too confident, that officials had been more certain than their knowledge justified. When he tried to find studies examining livestock health near nuclear test sites, he discovered very little research had been done. The focus had always been on human health, and even that was limited. Animal health was largely ignored, despite livestock being direct indicators of environmental contamination. They eat local plants, drink local water, spend their entire lives in potentially contaminated areas. If there were problems, livestock would show them. But nobody seemed interested in looking. Thomas's concerns, like so many others, faded into the background noise of rural life. He adapted, found ways to manage his flock, moved on. But the memory remained. The feeling that something had been done to this land that nobody wanted to fully acknowledge or investigate. These stories don't prove anything. That's important to emphasize. Anecdotal evidence is not scientific data. Individual experiences can't establish causation. Correlation is not proof. Any epidemiologist would correctly point out that illness occurs everywhere, that cancer rates vary for complex reasons, that livestock health fluctuates naturally, that water quality issues have many possible causes. But these stories do something else. They document the lived experience of people who hosted a nuclear experiment. They capture the lingering unease that persists when official assurances aren't matched by comprehensive investigation. They reveal the human cost of experiments, even when that cost can't be precisely quantified. And they raise a question that's never been satisfactorily answered. If Project Gasbuggy was truly as safe as officials claimed, why weren't more resources devoted to proving it? If there was nothing to hide, why not conduct thorough, long-term health studies? Why not maintain intensive monitoring for decades? Why not welcome independent research? The absence of investigation can be read two ways. Either it was unnecessary because there genuinely was no risk, or it was avoided because finding problems would create liability and political complications. Without more data, it's impossible to know which interpretation is correct. But for the people who lived through it, the people whose stories were recorded in fragments over the following decades, the ambiguity itself was a burden. The not knowing, the wondering, the suspicion that they had been used in an experiment and then forgotten, that their concerns weren't important enough to warrant serious attention. These are the voices that didn't make it into the official reports, the experiences that weren't captured in technical documentation, the human dimension of Project Gasbuggy that exists in memory and oral history rather than in the scientific record, and they persist, passed down from parents to children, remembered by older residents, occasionally surfacing when researchers ask the right questions, a parallel history running alongside the official narrative, never quite contradicting it, but never quite confirming it either. Chapter 8. A Pattern of Nuclear Experiments Project. Gasbuggy was not an isolated experiment. It was part of a broader pattern of nuclear stimulation tests that followed remarkably similar trajectories. Each began with optimism. Each promised economic benefits. Each encountered the same fundamental problem. And each was quietly abandoned while officials moved on to the next test. Understanding this pattern is crucial to understanding the deeper questions surrounding Gasbuggy. Because when an experiment fails once, it might be an anomaly. When it fails repeatedly, it suggests something more systematic. Project Rulison came next. Detonated in September 1969 near the town of Grand Junction in western Colorado. The site was about 40 miles from the city, in a region of high mesas and deep canyons. The landscape was similar to Gasbuggy, remote, sparsely populated, rich in natural gas trapped in tight rock formations. The device used in Rulison was even more powerful than Gasbuggy, 40 kilotons, nearly 3 times the yield of the Hiroshima bomb. The blast was designed to fracture a massive volume of rock, creating extensive pathways for gas to flow. Engineers were confident that lessons learned from Gasbuggy would lead to better results. The detonation went as planned. The device exploded thousands of feet underground. The earth shook. Buildings rattled in Grand Junction. Monitoring equipment recorded every detail. Containment held. No immediate radiation released to the surface. In the following weeks, engineers drilled into the fractured zone, extracted gas, measured flow rates. The results were technically impressive. The explosion had dramatically increased permeability. Gas flowed at rates far exceeding conventional wells in the same formation. On paper, Rulison was even more successful than Gasbuggy. But when the gas was analysed, the same problem emerged: radioactive contamination, tritium levels that made the gas unusable for commercial purposes. The experiment had replicated Gasbuggy's technical success and its fundamental failure. Officials described Rulison as economically impractical. The language was nearly identical to what had been used for Gasbuggy. Technically successful, but not commercially viable at current gas prices. The contamination issue was acknowledged but presented as a secondary consideration compared to economics. The pattern was becoming clear. Nuclear stimulation worked as an engineering concept, but it created resources that couldn't be used. Yet instead of acknowledging this fundamental flaw and abandoning the approach, the Atomic Energy Commission moved forward with even more ambitious tests. Project Rio Blanco, detonated in May 1973, represented the most complex nuclear stimulation attempt yet. Not one device, but 3. Detonated simultaneously at different depths in a single well. The yields totaled about 90 kilotons of explosive force. The intention was to fracture multiple gas-bearing formations with one operation, potentially making the economics work despite the contamination. The location was again in western Colorado, In an even more remote area of Rio Blanco County, the landscape was spectacular. Towering mesas, sheer cliffs, the kind of terrain that appears in Western films, and underneath, vast quantities of natural gas locked in rock that conventional technology couldn't exploit. The triple detonation was technically remarkable. 3 precisely timed nuclear explosions, each at a different depth, creating separate cavities and interconnected fracture networks. The seismic event was larger than previous tests. People felt it across a wider area, but containment held. The engineering was flawless, and once again, the extracted gas was too radioactive to use. The tritium levels were catastrophic from a commercial standpoint. 3 explosions meant 3 times the contamination. The problem hadn't been solved. It had been multiplied. Rio Blanco was declared, like its predecessors, economically impractical. The pattern of language remained consistent, technically successful, not commercially viable, unsuitable for development at current economic conditions. There were other tests too, smaller experiments, different configurations, various locations across the western United States, each seeking some variation that might overcome the contamination problem, each failing in essentially the same way. By the mid-1970s, the evidence was overwhelming. Nuclear stimulation didn't work as a commercial technology. The fundamental problem of radioactive contamination had no solution given the physics involved. You couldn't detonate a nuclear device without creating radioactive isotopes. Those isotopes would contaminate whatever resources you were trying to extract. The contamination couldn't be filtered out or processed away when it was molecular. Yet the tests continued for years after this became apparent. Why? Several factors contributed. First, institutional momentum. Programs don't stop easily. They have budgets, personnel, contractors, political supporters, congressional appropriations, facilities. All of this creates pressure to continue, even when the original justification has eroded. Second, sunk costs. By the time the contamination problem was clearly insurmountable, enormous resources had already been invested. Admitting failure would mean acknowledging that all those investments were wasted, that all the previous tests had been pointless. That's a difficult admission for any organisation to make. Third, career investments. Many scientists and engineers had built their professional reputations around nuclear stimulation. Their publications, their expertise, their status all derived from this program. Abandoning it would diminish their professional standing. There were strong personal incentives to continue, to hope that the next test might succeed where previous ones had failed. Fourth, ideological commitment. Project Plowshare wasn't just about engineering. It was about demonstrating that nuclear technology could be peaceful, that American nuclear capabilities could serve constructive purposes. This larger mission created pressure to keep trying, to avoid admitting that peaceful nuclear explosions were largely a fantasy. Fifth, the nature of bureaucratic decision-making. Each test could be justified on narrow grounds. This experiment will try a different device yield. That one will test a different rock formation. The next will attempt a new well configuration. Individually, each test seemed reasonable. Collectively, they constituted an inability to acknowledge a fundamental failure. The pattern across all these tests is striking. The same technical success, the same contamination problem, the same economic excuse, the same public reassurances, the same lack of long-term health studies, the same eventual abandonment. This repetition suggests that the lessons were being learned at some level, but not acted upon. Officials understood the contamination problem but chose to frame it as an economic issue rather than a safety issue. They knew the gas was unusable, but emphasized technical achievements rather than commercial failures. Why the euphemistic language? Why the consistent framing of failure as impracticality rather than contamination? Several reasons seem likely. Acknowledging that nuclear explosions inherently contaminate resources would raise uncomfortable questions about all peaceful nuclear applications under Plowshare. If you can't safely extract gas, can you safely create harbours, dig canals, excavate reservoirs? The contamination problem was potentially fatal to the entire program. It would also create liability issues. If the test deliberately contaminated natural resources, Communities near the sites might have grounds for legal action. The federal government could face claims for property damage, health effects and economic losses. Additionally, it would undermine public confidence in nuclear safety more broadly. The 1970s were already a difficult time for the nuclear industry. Public skepticism was growing, acknowledging that even underground explosions created persistent contamination would fuel opposition to nuclear power plants and weapons programs. By framing the failures as economic rather than scientific, officials preserved flexibility. Perhaps gas prices would rise, making contaminated gas economically viable despite processing challenges. Perhaps decontamination technology would improve. Perhaps future applications would be less sensitive to radiation. The economic framing left doors open that admitting fundamental contamination problems would close. But the cumulative effect of this pattern was to create a systematic avoidance of truth-telling. Each test produced similar results. Each was explained away with similar language. Each left communities with questions that weren't answered. Each added to a growing body of evidence that peaceful nuclear explosions had consequences nobody wanted to fully acknowledge. Project Ploughshare was formally terminated in 1977. The official explanation was that the programme's objectives could be achieved more efficiently with conventional technology. Nuclear excavation was more expensive than predicted. Nuclear stimulation wasn't commercially competitive. The political climate had shifted away from large-scale nuclear projects. All of these factors were true, but they weren't the whole truth. The real reason was simpler and more fundamental. Nuclear explosions contaminate whatever they touch, and contaminated resources are worse than no resources at all. The programme's legacy was dozens of nuclear devices detonated across the American West, radioactive isotopes distributed through rock formations, cavities and fractured zones that would remain radioactive for decades or centuries, and communities left with questions that were systematically avoided rather than answered. The pattern reveals something important about how institutions handle failure. They reframe it, minimise it, explain it away with technical language, move on to new projects while the consequences of old ones persist. And those consequences are left for others to deal with, often people with the least power to demand accountability. Chapter 9. What was never studied. In 1976, a researcher at the University of New Mexico proposed a comprehensive epidemiological study of communities near nuclear stimulation sites. The study would track cancer rates, respiratory illnesses, reproductive health outcomes, and other potential effects over multiple decades. It would establish baseline data and compare communities near test sites with demographically similar populations elsewhere. The proposal was thorough, the methodology sound, the research questions legitimate, the potential value to public health clear. The study was never funded. The Atomic Energy Commission showed no interest. State health departments declined to support it. Energy companies that had participated in the test didn't want to open questions that might create liability. The research died as a proposal, never becoming an actual investigation. This was not unique to nuclear stimulation sites. Across the history of nuclear testing in the United States, there's a consistent pattern of important health studies that were never conducted. Questions that should have been asked weren't. Data that should have been collected wasn't. Monitoring that should have continued for decades was discontinued after a few years. Understanding what was never studied is as important as understanding what was, because those gaps reveal institutional priorities. What gets investigated and what doesn't tells you what organisations actually care about versus what they claim to care about. Let's start with the most obvious gap: long-term health, outcomes in communities near gas buggy and similar sites. This should have been straightforward. Identify the population living within various distances from each test site. Track health outcomes over multiple decades. Compare rates of cancer, respiratory disease, reproductive problems, and other conditions with matched control populations. This kind of epidemiological research is standard in public health. It's how we identify environmental health hazards. It's how we connect exposure to outcomes. The methodology is well established. The value is clear. Yet it wasn't done for nuclear stimulation sites. The explanations offered for this absence vary. Small populations make statistical significance difficult to achieve. Rural areas have poor health records that make data collection challenging. Establishing causation is methodologically complex. The cost would be substantial. The results might not be conclusive. All of these are legitimate methodological concerns, but they're also convenient excuses. Small populations can still be studied, especially when combined with similar populations from multiple sites. Health records can be reconstructed with sufficient effort. Causation is always complex in environmental health, but that doesn't justify not trying. Costs are high, but public health research is routinely funded at similar levels for other hazards. The real barrier wasn't methodological, it was political. Conducting comprehensive health studies risked finding problems, and finding problems would require acknowledging responsibility, liability, compensation, public relations disasters, lawsuits, congressional investigations, media scrutiny. It was simpler and safer to not look. To assume that because monitoring in the immediate aftermath showed no dramatic effects, long-term effects must also be negligible. To let time pass and institutional memory fade. To avoid creating data that might contradict official assurances of safety. The second major gap is groundwater monitoring. The gas buggy device was detonated thousands of feet underground, but water moves through rock over geological timescales. Tritium and other isotopes could potentially migrate through fractures, fault lines, and permeable zones, eventually reaching aquifers used for drinking water and irrigation. Determining whether this happens requires sustained, comprehensive monitoring of groundwater throughout the region over many years. Well testing, isotope analysis, hydrological modelling, tracking how water moves through complex geological formations. This monitoring happened initially. Wells near the site were tested in the months and years following the detonation. The results showed no contamination. Officials declared this proof that the blast zone was isolated from water-bearing formations. But water moves slowly through rock. What looks isolated on a timescale of months or even years might not be isolated on a timescale of decades. Tritium has a half-life of 12 years, but that means it takes decades to decay to negligible levels. Long-term monitoring should have continued for at least 50 years to assess whether migration was occurring. Instead, monitoring was gradually scaled back. Annual testing became less frequent. The number of wells sampled decreased. The range of isotopes tested narrowed. Eventually, monitoring became sporadic and limited to immediate vicinity of the site. This created an epistemological problem. The absence of detected contamination could mean either that contamination wasn't occurring, or that monitoring was insufficient to detect it if it were occurring. Without sustained, comprehensive testing, it's impossible to distinguish between these possibilities. Official position remained that the depth and geology prevented migration, but that position was based on relatively short-term data and theoretical modelling, not on the kind of long-term empirical monitoring that would be needed to definitively prove it. The third gap is ecological impact assessment. Nuclear detonations affect more than just humans. They alter soil chemistry, change radiation levels in ways that affect plant growth, create contamination that moves through food chains, generate radon gas that can vent through soil to the surface, disturb geological stability in ways that might affect ecosystems. A comprehensive ecological study would track these effects over decades. Soil samples analysed for isotope concentrations and how they change over time. Plant tissue tested for uptake of radioactive elements. Wildlife populations monitored for health effects. Food chain analysis to understand how contamination moves through ecosystems. Radon measurements to assess ongoing gas emissions. This kind of research would provide crucial data about the full environmental impact of underground nuclear detonations. It would inform decisions about other nuclear programs. It would help assess risks to human populations who depend on those ecosystems. Yet such research was never conducted at gas buggy or other nuclear stimulation sites. Some baseline ecological data might have been collected before the tests. Some limited sampling might have occurred afterward. But comprehensive, sustained, systematic ecological monitoring didn't happen. Again, the explanations are practical. Ecological studies are expensive. They require specialized expertise. Ecosystems in the high desert are complex and variable, for reasons having nothing to do with nuclear tests. Separating nuclear effects from natural variation is methodologically challenging. But these challenges are surmountable with sufficient resources and commitment. Ecological research is conducted successfully in many contexts. The real barrier was priorities. Ecological effects weren't considered important enough to justify sustained investigation. The fourth gap is the blast zone itself. What is the current state of the cavity created by the explosion? How have the isotopes distributed through the fractured rock? Is there ongoing geochemical activity? Have the fractures closed or remained open? How has groundwater interaction with the blast zone evolved? Modern technology could answer these questions. Seismic imaging, borehole cameras, remote sensing, isotope mapping, sophisticated computer modelling. The tools exist to create detailed pictures of what's happening thousands of feet underground. Such investigations haven't been prioritised. The blast zones remain largely unexamined beyond initial post-detonation assessments. They're sealed and marked and left alone. The assumption is that containment worked, and nothing further needs to be known. But this assumption is based on limited data. The initial assessments told us what happened immediately after the blasts. They don't tell us what's happening decades later, how systems evolve, whether containment is stable long-term, what the current state actually is. Across all these areas, the pattern is the same: initial data collection, official conclusions based on that limited data, then a withdrawal of resources and attention. Questions that could be answered remain unasked. Studies that could be conducted remain unfunded. Monitoring that should continue is discontinued. This creates a situation where ignorance is maintained rather than overcome. The absence of evidence becomes evidence of absence. Officials can truthfully say there's no data showing harm. But there's no data partly because the data was never seriously pursued. For critics and conspiracy theorists, this pattern is deeply suspicious. Why avoid investigation unless you fear what might be found? Why not conduct thorough studies to definitively prove safety? Why not maintain monitoring indefinitely if you're confident there's no ongoing risk? The official response is that resources are limited, that every program must balance costs against benefits, that monitoring can't continue forever without evidence of problems, that methodological challenges make some research impractical, that existing data is sufficient to draw reasonable conclusions, but to communities affected by these tests, the lack of investigation feels like abandonment, a message that their concerns don't matter, that they were used for experiments and then forgotten, that official assurances of safety weren't backed up by the kind of rigorous, sustained investigation that would actually prove those assurances true. The gaps in knowledge aren't accidental. They're the result of decisions about what to study and what to ignore, about what questions matter and what questions can be avoided, about what constituencies deserve answers and what constituencies can be dismissed. And those decisions reveal something uncomfortable about how powerful institutions handle the consequences of their actions. They investigate when investigation serves their interests. They avoid investigation when it might, create problems, and the people most affected often have the least power to demand the answers they deserve. Chapter 10. The nuclear line that could not be crossed. To fully understand why Project Gas Buggy and its sister experiments were quietly abandoned rather than openly examined, you need to understand the political context of the 1970s, the era when nuclear optimism was collapsing, when trust in institutions was eroding, and the chickens of earlier confidence were coming home to roost. The narrative of nuclear safety that had sustained public support for decades was fracturing, and every new revelation, every admission of error, every acknowledgement of unanticipated consequences weakened it further. Consider what was happening in the broader nuclear landscape during this period. Reports were emerging about downwinders, people living downwind from the Nevada test site who had been exposed to fallout from atmospheric nuclear testing in the 50s and early 60s. Studies were finding elevated cancer rates, particularly thyroid cancer from radioactive iodine exposure. The government had assured these communities that the tests were safe, that exposure was minimal, that there was nothing to worry about. Those assurances were now revealed to be tragically wrong. Uranium miners were developing lung cancer at alarming rates. The men who had dug the uranium that fueled the nuclear age were dying from radiation exposure underground. They had been told the risks were minimal, that ventilation would protect them, that the radiation levels were safe. All of that turned out to be false. The knowledge existed that radon exposure caused lung cancer, but it hadn't been translated into adequate safety measures. Nuclear power plants were having accidents that weren't supposed to be possible. In 1979, 3 Mile Island would experience a partial meltdown. A combination of equipment failures and operator errors would lead to a release of radioactive gases and iodine. The accident wasn't catastrophic, but it shattered the image of nuclear power as inherently safe and controllable. In this environment, every nuclear program was under increasing scrutiny. The public was less willing to trust official assurances. The media was more aggressive in investigating nuclear issues. Lawmakers were responding to constituent concerns. The courts were more receptive to lawsuits alleging harm from nuclear activities. The nuclear establishment and the federal agencies overseeing it could not afford another scandal. Every admission of contamination, every acknowledgement of health effects, every recognition of consequences that had been downplayed eroded public confidence further. Project Gasbuggy represented a particularly uncomfortable truth in this context. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't an equipment failure. It wasn't a case of exposure limits being set too high. It was a deliberate detonation of nuclear devices for civilian purposes that had created contaminated resources that couldn't be used. This raised fundamental questions about the judgment and competence of the Atomic Energy Commission. If nuclear stimulation produced unusable, radioactive gas, why hadn't that been anticipated? If contamination was inevitable given the physics involved, why proceed with the tests? If the technology couldn't work commercially, why spend millions of dollars demonstrating that repeatedly? There were no good answers to these questions that didn't undermine the broader nuclear enterprise. Admitting that officials had known contamination would be a problem, but hoped to overcome it, would suggest recklessness. Admitting they hadn't anticipated it would suggest incompetence. Admitting they continued testing after the problem was clear would suggest institutional dysfunction. Better to frame the failures as economic, to emphasize technical achievements while downplaying commercial failures, to maintain that everything had been done safely, even if it wasn't done successfully, to gradually let the programs fade from public attention without prompting uncomfortable inquiries. There were also enormous liability issues at stake. If Project Gasbuggy or the other nuclear stimulation tests had caused health problems, the federal government could potentially be held responsible. The legal framework around government liability was complex, but lawsuits were increasingly successful in challenging sovereign immunity when negligence could be demonstrated. Compensation claims from affected communities could run into hundreds of millions of dollars. Medical costs, property value losses, pain and suffering, punitive damages. If a clear causal link between the tests and health effects were established, the financial exposure would be staggering, and it wouldn't stop with nuclear stimulation sites. Success in one lawsuit would embolden plaintiffs near other nuclear facilities, downwinders near the Nevada test site, communities near uranium mills, workers at nuclear weapons facilities. The potential cascade of claims was enormous. By not conducting thorough health studies, by not maintaining comprehensive monitoring, by not creating detailed documentation of potential harm, officials avoided creating the evidence base that future lawsuits might use. The absence of data became a shield against liability. This wasn't necessarily a conscious conspiracy. More likely, it was a series of rational decisions made by people trying to manage difficult situations with limited options. Don't fund studies that might find problems. Don't create documentation that might be used against you. Don't open inquiries that might spiral into political disasters. Frame failures in ways that minimize political and legal exposure. Each individual decision made sense from a narrow institutional perspective. Collectively, they ensured that the full truth about Project Gasbuggy and related experiments never received thorough examination. There was also the issue of institutional credibility. The Atomic Energy Commission had been promoting peaceful nuclear applications for over a decade. They had published countless reports. given hundreds of presentations, assured Congress and the public that Plowshare was a valuable program, spent substantial taxpayer money on research and development. Admitting that the entire enterprise had been misguided would be devastating to the agency's reputation. It would raise questions about what else they might be wrong about. It would empower critics of nuclear weapons programs. It would provide ammunition to opponents of nuclear power. It would undermine trust in government scientific expertise more broadly. Institutional survival instincts suggested minimizing the failures rather than analyzing them fully, emphasizing what had been learned rather than dwelling on what had gone wrong, moving on to new programs rather than lingering on old disappointments. By the late 70s, the political and cultural context had shifted decisively away from the nuclear optimism of the 50s and 60s. The dream of atomic-powered utopia had faded. Nuclear technology was increasingly seen as dangerous and problematic rather than miraculous and liberating. In this new context, projects like Gas Buggy became embarrassments rather than achievements. They represented the hubris of an earlier era, the overconfidence in technical solutions, cavalier attitude toward risks, the willingness to experiment on communities without their meaningful consent. Rather than engaging with this critique, rather than conducting the thorough investigations that might provide definitive answers to lingering questions, officials chose silence. The experiments were closed, the sites were sealed, the monitoring was discontinued, the documentation was filed away in archives, and communities were left with questions, with lingering concerns, with the suspicion that they had been used and abandoned, that promises of safety had been too confident, that official assurances weren't backed up by rigorous follow-through. The line that could not be crossed was full disclosure, acknowledging the complete truth about contamination, about the systematic failure of nuclear stimulation, about the gaps in health studies and environmental monitoring, about the prioritization of institutional interests over public health, about the decades-long pattern of minimizing consequences rather than confronting them. Crossing that line would require admitting uncomfortable truths, that nuclear technology had limitations the optimists hadn't anticipated, that peaceful applications of nuclear weapons were largely fantasy, that communities had been used as test subjects in experiments that predictably failed, that promises of safety had been overstated. These admissions would have been politically costly, economically costly, legally costly, institutionally costly. So the line was never crossed. The questions were never fully answered, and Project Gas Buggy remained buried, literally and figuratively. Chapter 11. The Documents That Disappeared. In 1983, a historian researching Cold War nuclear programs requested access to Project Gas Buggy documents through the Freedom of Information Act. The request was specific: technical reports on radiation monitoring, internal memos regarding commercial viability, health studies conducted in affected communities, communications between the Atomic Energy Commission and local officials. The response came months later. Many documents had been declassified and were available. Technical reports on the detonation itself, seismic data, initial radiation monitoring results, press releases and public communications. The historian received boxes of material, thousands of pages of technical documentation. But other documents were listed as missing, destroyed, or unlocatable. Internal correspondence about decision-making, drafts of reports that were revised before publication, meeting notes discussing concerns about contamination, recommendations that were apparently made but not followed. These documents had existed at one point. They were referenced in other files, but could not be located. The official explanation was bureaucratic mundane. Document retention policies meant that some materials were routinely destroyed after certain periods. Office moves and agency reorganizations had scattered files. The sheer volume of paperwork generated by nuclear programs made comprehensive preservation impossible. Some documents were simply lost in the enormous federal bureaucracy. These explanations are plausible. Government record-keeping, especially in the pre-digital era, was genuinely chaotic. Documents did get lost. Files were routinely purged. Reorganizations created confusion about where materials ended up. But there's another possibility. Some documents were deliberately withheld or destroyed because they contained information too sensitive for public release, not classified in the traditional national security sense, but politically problematic, evidence of concerns that weren't acted on, dissenting opinions that were overruled, warnings that were ignored, calculations showing that officials knew more about likely problems than they acknowledged publicly. Consider what kinds of documents might have existed. Internal memos discussing whether to proceed with gas buggy given earlier contamination concerns from Project Gnome. Meeting notes where scientists debated the likelihood of producing usable gas. Correspondence with energy companies about commercial viability doubts. Communications with health officials about monitoring protocols. Discussions about liability and public relations strategies. These documents, if they exist, would tell a more complete story than the sanitized technical reports and optimistic press releases that were preserved and released. They would reveal decision-making processes, show what officials actually thought privately versus what they said publicly, expose tensions between scientific concerns and institutional pressures. The absence of such documents creates a gap in the historical record. Future researchers work with incomplete information. The story that gets told is necessarily partial, shaped by what evidence survived or was made available. This pattern of selective document preservation appears throughout the history of nuclear programs. Documents supporting official narratives are carefully maintained and readily available. Documents revealing doubts, dissent, or problematic decision-making are scarce, lost, or heavily redacted. In some cases, researchers have found that documents released through Freedom of Information requests are redacted not for national security reasons, but for reasons listed as protecting deliberative processes or exempting agency communications. These exemptions are legally valid but have the effect of hiding institutional decision-making from public scrutiny. Other researchers have reported finding references to studies or reports that were apparently commissioned but never published, health surveys that were conducted but whose results don't appear in the public record, risk assessments that were prepared but not widely distributed. The existence of these ghost documents is inferred from budget allocations, passing references in other materials, or testimony from people who remember working on them. Why would studies be commissioned but not published? Perhaps the results were inconclusive and not worth the effort of formal publication. Perhaps they were duplicative of other work. Perhaps they were intended for internal use only. Or perhaps they found things that officials preferred not to publicise, results that contradicted official assurances, data suggesting that risks were higher than acknowledged, evidence that would create political or legal problems if widely known. Without access to these materials, it's impossible to know, and that's precisely the problem. The absence of evidence can't be definitively interpreted. It could represent genuine loss or routine destruction, or it could represent selective preservation designed to manage the historical narrative. Conspiracy theorists naturally gravitate toward the latter interpretation. They see patterns of missing documents as evidence of cover-ups, of deliberate concealment, of institutional bad faith. Skeptics counter that conspiracy theories overestimate government competence, that bureaucracies are disorganized, not deviously efficient. That mundane incompetence explains document loss better than elaborate plots. That the sheer volume of materials generated by large programs makes complete preservation impossible. Both perspectives have some validity. Government records management is genuinely chaotic, but it's also true that institutions protect themselves, that document retention policies can be written to ensure that sensitive materials don't survive, that officials understand what should and shouldn't be committed to writing. The truth likely lies somewhere in the middle. Some documents were lost through genuine bureaucratic dysfunction. Others were never created because officials understood they might be problematic. Still, others might have been deliberately withheld or destroyed because they contained politically sensitive information. What's indisputable is that the documentary record of Project Gas Buggy and related experiments is incomplete. Future researchers work with evidence that has passed through multiple layers of institutional filtering. The story told by available documents is necessarily shaped by decisions about what to preserve, what to release, and what to withhold. This matters because historical understanding depends on documentary evidence. Without complete records, We can't fully understand decision-making processes, can't assess what officials knew and when they knew it, can't determine whether concerns were raised and ignored or genuinely not anticipated, can't evaluate whether promises of safety were made in good faith or despite internal doubts. The gaps in documentation leave space for competing narratives. Official accounts emphasise technical achievements and careful safety measures. Critics point to evidence of contamination and inadequate follow-up. Both sides work with incomplete information, filling gaps with different assumptions about institutional behaviour and official motivations. And communities affected by the experiments are left without definitive answers, without the documentary evidence that would allow them to understand fully what was done, why it was done, and whether concerns like theirs were privately acknowledged even if publicly dismissed. The missing documents represent missing accountability. The records that would allow full historical reckoning are unavailable, and whether that's due to bureaucratic incompetence or institutional self-protection, the effect is the same. The full truth remains elusive. Epilogue. The test beneath the desert. If you drive southeast from Farmington today, following the highways that cut through the high desert of northwestern New Mexico, you'll eventually reach the vicinity of the old gas buggy site. The exact location isn't marked on standard maps. No tourist signs point the way. Nothing in the landscape announces that this was once the site of a nuclear detonation. The land looks much as it must have looked before December 1967. Red rock and sandstone formations rising from scrubland, juniper trees twisted by wind, dry arroyos waiting for the brief thunderstorms that provide the region's sparse rainfall. The kind of landscape that seems timeless, unchanged by human activity. But if you know where to look, if you have the right coordinates and access permissions, you can find the markers, weathered signs indicating restricted access, sealed wells marked with identification numbers, survey monuments recording precise locations. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would warn a casual visitor of the history beneath their feet. The sagebrush grows, the wind blows, ravens circle overhead. The sky stretches endlessly in that way unique to high desert country. It's a landscape that appears untouched by human intervention except for the faint traces, a dirt road, a fence line, those scattered markers that hint at something more. But thousands of feet below, in darkness and silence, the legacy of that December afternoon persists. The cavity still exists where solid rock once stood. Approximately 70 feet in diameter, a void created by nuclear fire that vaporized millions of pounds of stone in a fraction of a second. The walls of that cavity are glass, rock melted by impossible heat, and then frozen in place as the temperatures dropped. Surrounding the cavity, fractures extend for hundreds of feet in every direction, cracks in ancient stone that have existed for over half a century now. Pathways created by the shockwave that might remain open or might have slowly closed as geological pressures reasserted themselves over time. And throughout this altered zone, isotopes continue their slow work of decay. Tritium following its 12-year half-life, gradually diminishing but still present decades after the detonation. Other radioactive elements operating on their own schedules, some with half-lives measured in years, others in centuries or millennia. The physics is inexorable. Atoms decay according to mathematical certainties that don't care about human concerns or regrets. The radiation is real, present, measurable for anyone with the right instruments and access to the site. What's unclear is whether this radiation matters anymore, whether it affects anything at the surface, whether it migrated into water tables or remained confined to the blast zone, whether it poses any risk to current or future populations, whether the assurances given in 1967 have held true, or whether consequences unfolded that were never documented. These questions remain unanswered not because they can't be answered, but because answering them has never been prioritised. The monitoring that would provide definitive data was discontinued. The studies that would assess long-term impacts were never funded. The investigations that would reveal the complete truth were never pursued. In Farmington and the surrounding communities, very few people think about Project Gasbuggy anymore. It's ancient history, an event from an era that feels distant and strange. The generation that lived through it is dying off. Younger residents often don't know it happened at all. Occasionally researchers appear, historians working on Cold War projects, scientists studying nuclear testing legacies, journalists investigating government experiments. They interview old-timers who remember, review documents in archives, visit the site and take photographs. Then they leave, taking their questions back to universities or newsrooms far away. The land remains. The isotopes continue their decay. The fractures persist in the rock. The questions linger unanswered. And the story exists in fragments. Technical reports and oral histories, official assurances and personal doubts, documented facts and unexamined consequences. Project Gasbuggy proved several things conclusively. That nuclear explosions can fracture rock, that gas flow can be increased through tight formations, that underground detonations can be conducted without immediate surface releases, that all the technical objectives engineers set for themselves could be achieved. What it didn't prove is that we understood the full implications of what we were doing, that we adequately assessed the risks to communities hosting the experiments, that we followed through with the monitoring and health studies necessary to verify our safety assurances, that we prioritised public health over institutional interests. Most importantly, it didn't prove that we learned from the experience, because the pattern repeated across multiple sites. The same technical success, the same contamination, the same abandonment of comprehensive follow-up, the same framing of failure as economics rather than fundamental flaws. The conspiracy theory around Project Gasbuggy isn't about secret plots or hidden truths in the dramatic sense. It's about something more mundane and perhaps more troubling. The systematic avoidance of uncomfortable questions, the prioritization of institutional reputation over public transparency, the willingness to let time and distance obscure accountability. It's about a test that worked exactly as designed and revealed exactly why it shouldn't have been done. And rather than confront that truth, rather than conduct the thorough investigations that would provide definitive answers, officials chose a different path. Minimize, reframe, move on. Let time do its work of forgetting. The desert is patient. It keeps secrets well. But the questions remain for anyone willing to look. Why weren't long-term health studies conducted? Why was monitoring discontinued? Why are key documents missing? Why weren't independent investigations welcomed? Why is the default position that absence of evidence equals evidence of absence? These questions don't require conspiracy theories to ask. They require only a recognition that powerful institutions don't always prioritize the interests of the less powerful. That promises are sometimes made more confidently than knowledge justifies, that experiments have human costs that aren't always acknowledged or compensated. The cavity is still there, thousands of feet down in the darkness. The radiation is still present, following the immutable laws of nuclear physics. The fractures still run through ancient stone, and the story, like the isotopes, persists, mostly invisible, present nonetheless, waiting for anyone willing to dig deep enough to find it. Because Project Gasbuggy's real lesson was never about whether we could fracture the Earth with nuclear fire. We proved we could. The lesson was about whether we should, about whether technical capability equals wisdom, about what we owe to communities that host our experiments, about what happens when confidence exceeds understanding, about the questions we choose to ask and the ones we choose to avoid. And that lesson remains unlearned, buried beneath the desert, like the cavity itself, out of sight, easy to forget, but undeniably real for anyone paying attention. The file shouldn't have existed. Clara Rains had spent 3 years analysing radar anomalies for Sentinel Defence Analytics, cross-referencing FAA flight paths with weather patterns, satellite debris, and the occasional flock of geese that confused outdated tracking systems. She'd seen every kind of glitch, every data corruption, every bureaucratic mislabelling that could make a spreadsheet lie. But she'd never seen 3 separate federal databases, FAA, FEMA, and CDC, share the same incident code for events that had nothing to do with each other, until now. It was 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in March 2026 when the pattern emerged. Clara sat in her cramped Darlington apartment, the glow of dual monitors casting blue light across her face. Outside, the distant hum of the metro's last train faded into silence. She'd been running a routine check on rural radar anomalies, the kind of busy work that kept her contract renewed, when the algorithm flagged something unusual. 3 incidents, 3 different states, 3 different months. January 14th. Meteor sighting, Cisco, Utah. FAA logged unusual radar signature. Local fire department responded to reports of impact. FEMA designated it ENV-071KD. Follow-up, closed within 18 hours. February 3rd, mass illness event Durbin, West Virginia. CDC investigated reports of 17 residents experiencing identical hallucinations. Designation ENV-071KD. Follow-up, attributed to contaminated well water. Case closed. March 9th. Missing persons. Loma, Montana. 4 hikers disappeared during clear weather. FEMA deployed emergency assessment team. Designation ENV-071KD. Follow-up. Individuals found disoriented but unharmed, no further action. The designation code was the hook. ENV-071KD didn't match any standard federal classification system. Clara had memorised FEMA's taxonomy during her first year at Sentinel. Every prefix, every suffix, every bureaucratic shorthand that turned disasters into data points. This code was wrong. Or more accurately, it was right in a way that shouldn't be possible. She pulled up the incident reports. Each one listed the same cleanup team in the footnotes. Department. 7 response unit. Clara opened a new browser tab and accessed the federal agency directory through her contractor credentials. She typed Department 7, no results found. She tried variations. Department 7, 7th Department, Division 7. She expanded her search to include the Office of Personnel Management Database, the Congressional Budget Office's agency listings, even the Freedom of Information Act reading room, and nothing. The clock read 12:33 a.m. Clara leaned back in her chair, the leather creaking in the silence. In Washington, agencies didn't simply not exist. Even the most classified operations, JSOC's Grey Fox, the NSA's Tailored Access Operations, the DOE's Nuclear Emergency Support Team, left paper trails, budget line items, redacted organisational charts, acronyms in appropriations bills. But Department 7 had no shadow, no trace, no echo in any database she could access. She should have closed her laptop and gone to bed, should have dismissed it as a data entry error, some clerk in 3 different agencies accidentally typing the same wrong code, should have remembered that curiosity was a liability in her line of work. Instead, she downloaded all 3 incident reports to an encrypted drive, cleared her browser history, and decided to dig deeper. That decision would be the last normal choice she'd ever make. Clara spent the next week building a timeline. She worked carefully, methodically, the way her father had taught her during the summer. He'd tried to get her interested in bird watching. Pattern recognition, he'd said, pointing to migration routes on a map. It's not about seeing one bird, it's about seeing where they all go. She pulled archived news reports from the 3 towns. Cisco, Utah. Local paper ran a brief story about the meteor, included a quote from a resident who described men in dark suits arriving before the fire department. The follow-up article, published 2 days later, made no mention of suits or federal agents, just a meteorite fragment donated to the local college. Durbin, West Virginia. Nothing in the news archives at all. Clara found a deleted social media post, cached by a web scraper, from a resident claiming government people had quarantined the elementary school for testing. The post had been removed within 6 hours. Loma, Montana. The missing hiker's story made regional news, but the official report was bland. 4 hikers from Seattle got separated from their trail group, spent a night in the woods, experienced mild hypothermia and confusion. A park ranger found them the next morning. The incident report listed no ranger's name. Clara cross-referenced the dates with satellite imagery from commercial providers. Cisco, thermal bloom consistent with impact, followed by ground vehicles arriving within 2 hours, at 3 a.m, long before local emergency services were notified. Durbin, no unusual activity visible, but cell tower data showed a 5-hour communications blackout in a 3-mile radius. Loma, cloud cover obscured the area during the critical 48 hours. Every lead led to a gap. Every question led to silence. On Thursday evening, Clara broke protocol. She called an old colleague from her graduate program at Georgetown, Marcus Webb, who'd taken a position with the Defense Intelligence Agency's Open Source Analysis Division. They met at a coffee shop in DuPont Circle, the kind of anonymous place where half the customers were having quiet conversations about things they shouldn't discuss in public. "You look like you haven't slept," Marcus said, stirring sugar into his espresso. "I need you to look up something for me," quietly. "I'm not pulling classified files, Clara. Not asking you to. Just check the DIA's unclassified organisational records. Tell me if you've ever heard of Department 7. Marcus frowned. "Department 7 of what?" "That's what I'm asking." He pulled out his phone, spent 2 minutes scrolling, then shook his head. "Nothing." "Why? You ever come across an incident code ENV071KD? "No, that's not a standard format." "Where'd you see it?" Clara hesitated. "Just something that crossed my desk. Probably nothing." Marcus leaned forward, lowering his voice. "If it's probably nothing, why do you look scared?" She didn't answer. Instead, she asked, "You ever hear stories about cleanup teams? Federal, but not from any specific agency? You mean like NEST? They're DOE? No, unmarked, just present when weird things happen, then gone." Marcus set down his cup. "Clara, if you've stumbled onto something operational, you need to report it through proper channels and then forget about it. Seriously, I've seen contractors lose their clearances for less. What if the proper channels don't acknowledge it exists? Then it definitely doesn't exist, and you should stop asking." He stood, leaving a 20 on the table. "I mean it. Some doors stay closed for good reasons." Clara watched him leave. She finished her coffee in silence, then took the metro back to Arlington, checking over her shoulder 3 times before entering her building. That night she found the photographs. She'd requested field documentation from the Cisco incident through a Freedom of Information Act query, a routine request that should have taken months to process. Instead, the response arrived in 4 days, a PDF containing 12 heavily redacted pages and 6 photographs. The photos showed the impact site: scorched earth, a shallow crater, scattered fragments of dark material, standard meteor documentation. But in the background of the third photo, Clara spotted something the redaction team had missed. 3 vehicles parked in formation, dark SUVs with no visible markings. She zoomed in. The resolution degraded, but she could make out a small emblem on the lead vehicle's door. White numbers on a black circular background. 7-13-4. Clara saved the image, enhanced it using forensic software, and confirmed what she'd seen. The badge was deliberately minimal, no agency name, no seal, just numbers. A designation that meant nothing to anyone outside a very specific circle. She ran the number sequence through pattern analysis. 7-13-4 could be a unit identifier, a radio call sign, a budget code. Or it could be nothing, random numbers chosen precisely because they conveyed no information. But if they meant nothing, why use them at all? Clara opened a secure document and began writing everything down. Every incident, every connection, every gap in the official record. She backed it up to 3 separate cloud services under false names, printed a hard copy, and sealed it in an envelope she hid behind her bathroom mirror. At 2:17 a.m., her phone rang. The number was blocked. Clara stared at the screen for 3 rings before answering. Silence. Hello? Nothing. Not even breathing. Just the faint hiss of an open line. Who is this? The call ended. Clara checked her phone logs. The incoming call didn't appear. No duration, no number, no record it had ever happened. She didn't sleep that night. Friday morning, Clara arrived at work to find an email waiting in her inbox. The sender was listed as Federal Records Compliance Office, an entity she'd never heard of. The subject line read, FOIA Request Number 2026-03-FAA-7719-DENIED. She opened it. Your request for field documentation regarding incident ENV071KD, Cisco, UT, has been reviewed and denied under 5 U.S.C. Section 552B1. The requested materials are classified in the interest of national security. No further information can be provided at this time. This denial is final and not subject to administrative appeal. Clara checked her FOIA tracking portal. Request number 2026-03-FAI-7719 didn't exist in the system. She'd never been assigned that number. More importantly, she'd already received the documents. She had them saved on her laptop. Someone was trying to erase what she'd already seen. Clara closed her email and opened a private browser window. She navigated to a file-sharing service and uploaded every document she'd collected, setting the folder to auto-delete in 72 hours unless she renewed it. Then she sent the link to herself at 3 different email addresses, including one she'd created in college and hadn't used in years. Insurance. She spent the day working on routine tasks, acting normal, laughing at a co-worker's joke about the office coffee machine, but every time someone walked past her cubicle, she tensed. At 4:30 p.m, her supervisor stopped by. Gerald Costner, a former Air Force intelligence officer who'd transitioned to the private sector and spent most of his time in meetings. He smiled, casual and friendly. Clara, you have a minute? Sure, what's up? Just wanted to check in. You've been putting in a lot of late hours this week, everything okay? Yeah, just trying to clear some backlog before the quarterly review. Good. Listen, I noticed you put in a FOIA request last week, Cisco Meteor thing. Clara's stomach tightened. Yeah, just routine. Wanted to see if there was any debris that might explain the radar signature. Find anything interesting? Not really. Pretty standard Meteor documentation. Gerald nodded, still smiling. Great. Hey, just so you know, FOIA requests need to be cleared through my desk first. Contractor policy. No big deal, just make sure to loop me in next time. Of course. Sorry about that. No problem. He tapped her cubicle wall twice, a casual gesture. Have a good weekend. Clara waited until he was out of sight before exhaling. She pulled up her company's contractor handbook and searched for the FOIA policy. There was no requirement to clear requests through supervision. Not for unclassified materials, which was what she'd requested. Gerald was lying. At 5 p.m, Clara packed her laptop, took the elevator down to the parking garage, and sat in her car for 10 minutes watching the exit ramp. No one followed her out. No unfamiliar vehicles lingered nearby. She drove home through rush hour traffic, taking random turns, doubling back twice. Nothing. She was being paranoid. Had to be. But when she arrived home and checked her apartment, she found her bathroom mirror slightly askew. The envelope she'd hidden behind it was gone. Clara stopped sleeping. She'd read somewhere that the human body could survive on 4 hours of sleep a night for weeks, though cognition degraded over time. She allowed herself 2-hour shifts, setting alarms, keeping her phone in her hand even while unconscious. Every creak in the building woke her. Every car door slam outside sent her to the window. She didn't go back to work on Monday. Instead, she called in sick, then drove to a public library in Silver Spring and used their computers to continue her research. The librarian barely glanced at her ID. Clara accessed the commercial satellite archives again, this time focusing on the Montana incident. Loma was a town of 487 people, surrounded by national forest. The kind of place where hikers went missing just often enough that local search and rescue teams had a routine. The 4 missing hikers, Sarah Donnelly, Marcus Price, Jennifer Torres and Kyle Hammond, had been experienced backcountry campers, all in their 30s, all from Seattle. The official Park Service report stated they'd been found 16 miles from their last known position, dehydrated and confused, with no memory of the intervening 31 hours. Medical evaluations showed elevated cortisol levels and minor abrasions, but nothing that explained their disorientation. Clara found a podcast that had covered the incident. The host interviewed a local sheriff who described the federal response as overkill for a simple rescue. When asked which agency had responded, the sheriff paused, then said, "They didn't say. Had badges, but I didn't catch the department." The podcast had been posted 3 weeks ago. Clara tried to access it now. The episode had been removed. The show's website listed all episodes except that one. She found a cached version through a web archive and downloaded the audio file. At timestamp 23:17, the sheriff said something she'd missed in the transcript. They set up a perimeter around the recovery site. Wouldn't let our people in until they'd secured the scene. I asked what they were securing. These were hikers, not criminals. Guy just looked at me and said, "Contamination protocol." Never explained what that meant. Contamination protocol. For missing hikers. Clara dug deeper into the background of the 4 individuals. Marcus Price's social media had gone dark after his rescue. His last post was from the trailhead, a photo of sunrise over the mountains. His Facebook profile still existed, but every post after the incident had been deleted. His friends' comments remained. "Glad you're okay, man. Call me when you can talk about it." She found a phone number for Marcus Price through a people search site and called it. The line rang 4 times before going to voicemail. His voice sounded tired. "This is Marcus. Leave a message." "Mr. Price, my name is Clara Rains. I'm a researcher looking into unusual federal responses to outdoor incidents. I was hoping to ask you a few questions about your experience in Montana last month. Please call me back at this number. It's important." She left her burner phone number, a prepaid cell she'd bought with cash that morning. 3 hours later, it rang. "Hello? You called about Montana?" The voice was male, cautious, not Marcus Price. "Who is this?" "Doesn't matter. You need to stop asking questions about that." "I just want to understand what happened." "No, you don't. Trust me, Marcus doesn't remember, and that's a mercy." "What do you mean he doesn't remember?" "I mean exactly what I said. Whatever they did to him, to all of them, it worked. He can't even talk about it without getting panic attacks. Leave it alone." "Who did something to him? Who are they?" The line went dead. Clara tried calling back. The number didn't connect. She sat in her car in the library parking lot, hands shaking. Someone was watching these incidents. Someone was intervening with witnesses, and someone knew she was asking questions. That night she found Major Emmett Crowley. Crowley's name appeared in a declassified Air Force memo from 1987, a routine personnel reassignment document that listed him as a radar technician, stationed at Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana. Clara found his name again in a 2003 Veterans Forum post, where he'd commented on a thread about unexplained radar contacts. His post had been deleted, but the quote remained in someone's reply. "We tracked them for years." The official story was always weather balloons or equipment malfunction, but some of us knew better. She tracked him through public records to a small town in New Mexico, where he'd retired 10 years ago. His address led her to a trailer park outside Roswell. Ironic, Clara thought, given the town's history. She drove 17 hours straight, stopping only for gas and coffee. The landscape shifted from green to brown, humid to arid, dense to sparse. By the time she reached Roswell, it was late afternoon, the sun turning the desert gold. Crowley's trailer was clean but weathered, a wind chime hanging by the door. Clara knocked 3 times before an old man answered. He was thin, maybe 70, with sharp eyes that assessed her immediately. "If you're selling something, I'm not interested." "Major Crowley?" "My name is Clara Rains. I need to talk to you about Department 7. His expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. He glanced past her, scanning the empty street, then stepped aside. You'd better come in. The interior was sparse. A couch, a television, a bookshelf filled with aviation manuals and Tom Clancy novels. Crowley gestured to the couch and took a seat in a recliner opposite her. "How'd you find me?" "Public records. I'm a data analyst. Pattern recognition is what I do." "And what pattern led you to me?" Clara pulled out a folder containing printouts of everything she'd collected. 3 incidents, 3 different agencies responding with the same designation code, a cleanup team that doesn't exist in any federal database, and witnesses who either can't remember what happened or disappear from public record. Crowley took the folder, flipping through pages without comment. When he finished, he set it on the coffee table and leaned back. "You shouldn't be looking into this. Everyone keeps telling me that. No one tells me why. Because the people who run Department 7 are very good at making problems go away. And right now, you're a problem. So it does exist. Officially? Number? In practice?" He gestured at her folder. "You've already seen the evidence. They've been around since 1952, born out of Project Blue Book's classified annex. You know about Blue Book? Air Force program that investigated UFO sightings, closed in 1969. That's the public story. The truth is that Blue Book had 2 tracks. Track 1 handled the explainable stuff. Weather balloons, aircraft, Venus. Track 2 handled everything else. The cases where the physics didn't work. The cases where witnesses experienced shared delusions. The cases where something was left behind. Left behind by what? That's the wrong question. 7 doesn't care what causes the events. They care about containment. Their job is to maintain consensus reality. When something happens that contradicts what people believe is possible, 7 arrives and rewrites the scene. They're not covering up aliens or time travellers. They're erasing contradictions. Clara leaned forward. What kind of contradictions? Crowley stood and walked to his bookshelf. He pulled down a binder and handed it to her. Inside were photocopied documents, incident reports, budget memos, personnel rosters, all stamped with classification markings all decades old. 1974, Dulce, New Mexico. Entire town reported seeing geometric lights hovering for 6 hours. Hundreds of witnesses. News crews showed up. Then 7 arrived. Within 48 hours, every video was confiscated, every witness was interviewed, and the official story became military flares. A year later, half the witnesses couldn't remember seeing anything unusual. How is that possible? You'd have to ask them, but I've heard rumours. DARPA programs, neural interference tech, targeted electromagnetic fields. They don't just erase evidence, they erase memory. Clara paged through the binder. Another incident. 1989, Shoshone National Forest. A group of hunters found a clearing where all vegetation had been desiccated overnight. The ground fused into glass. Department 7 response team arrived, declared the area contaminated and removed everything. Official explanation: lightning strike. "Why are you telling me this?" Clara asked. "Because you're already in their crosshairs, and maybe if you understand what you're dealing with, you'll be smart enough to stop." Crowley sat down again. "I spent 30 years tracking radar anomalies. I learned to recognise the pattern. Every few months something would happen. Time distortions, energy blooms, mass cognitive events. And every time, 7 would show up. They'd scrub the site, interview witnesses and disappear. I tried to compile a comprehensive report in 1995. 2 weeks later I was reassigned to a desk job in Alaska. The message was clear. But you kept records, copies, hidden, because I knew someone would eventually come asking." He looked at her carefully. "You're not the first. Over the years, a few others have stumbled onto the pattern. Journalists, researchers, people like you. They ask questions, dig too deep, and then they disappear. Not violently. They just stop. New jobs in other states, sudden career changes. Sometimes they seem fine, just uninterested in the topic anymore, like someone flipped a switch." Clara's hands felt cold. "What do I do? Stop. Right now. Delete everything. Forget this conversation and move on with your life." "And if I don't?" Crowley sighed. "Then you'll meet them eventually. And when you do, you'll have a choice. Most people choose to forget. It's easier that way." Clara stood, clutching the binder. "Can I keep this? I made it for you." But understand, possessing those documents makes you a target. They've already noticed you. Now you're carrying proof. Then they already know everything. Probably. Crowley walked her to the door. "Good luck, Miss Rains. I hope you're smarter than I was." She drove back to her hotel room and spent the night scanning every page of Crowley's binder. Incident after incident, stretching back decades. The details varied, but the pattern remained consistent. Anomalous event, witness reports, Department 7 response, immediate cleanup, official explanation, fading memory. By 4 a.m, Clara had compiled a timeline that spanned 70 years. If Crowley was right, Department 7 wasn't just responding to unusual events. They were maintaining a specific version of reality, one where certain things simply didn't happen. But why? And on whose authority? She needed to see them in action. The alert came through on a Thursday morning. Clara had set up monitoring scripts across multiple platforms, FEMA dispatch channels, local news wires, social media, even amateur radio frequencies. She was looking for patterns, sudden federal mobilization, unexplained communications blackouts, stories that appeared and then vanished. At 7:43 a.m, her system flagged a cluster of social media posts from Thornton, Montana, population 1,122, located in a valley surrounded by national forest. The post described pillars of light visible above the tree line, lasting approximately 20 minutes before fading. One user posted a blurry photo showing vertical columns of luminescence, like aurora borealis constrained to narrow beams. By 8 a.m, several posts had been deleted. By 8:30, the local news site removed its brief article about the phenomenon. Clara checked FEMA's dispatch logs, no activity. FAA radar showed no unusual contacts. Weather Service reported clear skies. But at 9:15 a.m, her monitoring script caught a spike in encrypted radio traffic in the area, using frequencies associated with federal emergency response. She was in her car within 10 minutes. Thornton was a 9-hour drive from Roswell. Clara pushed her rental car to 80 miles per hour across empty highways, stopping only once for gas and energy drinks. She reached the Montana border by evening, the sky dimming to purple as she navigated through increasingly rural terrain. She arrived at Thornton just before midnight. The town was dark, most houses unlit, a single gas station glowing like a beacon on the main street. Clara parked at a motel on the edge of town and checked in under a false name, paying cash. In her room, she assembled her equipment, a digital camera with a telephoto lens, a radio scanner, binoculars, and a small drone she'd purchased 3 days ago. The drone was consumer grade but had a decent camera and could fly for 30 minutes on a single battery. At 1:30 a.m, Clara drove to the location where the light pillars had been reported, a forestry road leading to a hilltop with a view of the valley. She parked half a mile away and hiked the rest of the distance, carrying her equipment in a backpack. The hilltop offered a clear view. Below, Thornton spread out in a grid of streetlights and dark houses. Beyond it, the forest stretched into darkness. Clara set up her camera and waited. At 2:47 a.m, headlights appeared on the road below. 3 vehicles, dark SUVs moving in formation, no emergency lights, driving with deliberate speed. They turned onto a side road leading into the forest, toward the area where the light pillars had been reported. Clara launched the drone, keeping it low, using the trees as cover. The infrared camera showed the vehicles stopping in a clearing 2 miles into the forest. Figures emerged, 6 people in plain dark clothing, moving with practiced efficiency. They unloaded equipment from the vehicles, metal cases, tripods, devices Clara didn't recognize. One person set up a perimeter using what looked like portable fencing. Another assembled a sensor array on a telescoping pole. Clara zoomed in with her camera. The vehicles had badges on their doors. Even in low light she could make out the design. A black circle, white numbers, 7-13-4. She was watching Department 7 work. For the next hour, Clara documented everything. The team moved methodically, scanning the clearing with handheld devices, collecting samples of soil and vegetation, assembling what looked like lead-lined containment pods. One person stayed by the vehicles holding a tablet, occasionally speaking into a radio. At 4:15 a.m, Clara noticed something. One of the team members was looking around, scanning the tree line. He raised binoculars and pointed them directly toward her position. She froze. The man lowered his binoculars and raised one hand. He waved. Clara's breath caught. She was 300 yards away, concealed in darkness behind trees. There was no way he could see her, but he'd waved directly at her. She recalled the drone, packed her equipment, and ran back to her car. Her hands shook as she started the engine. She drove back to the motel, watching her mirrors, expecting headlights to appear behind her. Nothing. In her room, Clara immediately transferred the drone footage and photos to her encrypted cloud storage. She reviewed the images, zooming in on every detail. The team's equipment was unmarked. The vehicles had no license plates, just federal government tags with alphanumeric codes. She checked her camera's GPS data. Every photo she'd taken showed the correct location coordinates except for one, the image of the man waving. That photo's GPS coordinates placed it in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Impossible. Clara packed everything, checked out of the motel at 5:30 a.m. and started driving south. She wanted to put distance between herself and Thornton, get back to populated areas, somewhere with witnesses, somewhere safe. At 6 a.m. she stopped at a diner for coffee. While waiting for her order, she checked her phone. 3 new emails, all from addresses she didn't recognise, all sent within the last 20 minutes. She opened the first one. It was empty except for an attachment. The photo of the man waving at her. The same photo she'd just taken. But this version was different. The timestamp showed it had been taken 2 minutes before she'd pressed the shutter. The second email contained a satellite image of the hilltop where she'd been standing, marked with a red circle. The image was time-stamped 2:46 a.m, 1 minute before the vehicles had arrived. The third email had no attachment, just one sentence. "You're very good at this." Clara deleted the emails, paid for her coffee without drinking it, and got back in her car. She drove for 3 hours, taking random exits, changing directions, before finally stopping at a rest area outside Billings. Her laptop was in the trunk. She opened it, expecting to find her files intact. Every photo from Thornton was gone. The drone footage, deleted. The cloud backup, empty. Her car's GPS history had been wiped, but her documents folder contained one new file, rains_c_event_log.pdf. Clara opened it. Inside was a complete dossier on her. Her education, employment history, security clearance application, every FOIA request she'd ever filed, her home address, her parents' names, her college transcripts, photos of her at work, at home, driving her car. The last page contained a single line. Department 7 extends its regards. Below that, a phone number. Clara stared at the screen. They weren't threatening her. They were introducing themselves. She closed the laptop and sat in her car, watching trucks rumble past on the interstate. She should run, should disappear, should take Crowley's advice and forget everything. Instead, she took out her burner phone and dialed the number. It rang once. "Hello, Clara." The voice was male, calm, professional. "We've been expecting your call." The man on the phone called himself Agent D. Marrow. He didn't offer a first name, didn't explain what the D stood for. He spoke with the measured tone of someone accustomed to delivering information that wouldn't be questioned. "You've done impressive work," he said. "Most people stop after the first warning. You kept going." "Who are you?" "I think you already know the answer to that. Department 7, in a manner of speaking. The designation is more of a filing convention than an official name. We operate under various administrative codes depending on the fiscal quarter and operational requirements. You're telling me you're real. We're as real as we need to be. Would you like to meet in person? I think we have things to discuss." Clara's instinct was to refuse. Every thriller she'd ever read, every conspiracy documentary she'd watched, taught her that accepting such an invitation was how people vanished. But she'd already crossed too many lines. They had her home address, they had her files. Running wouldn't help. Where? Denver. Tomorrow. There's a federal building at 1961 Stout Street. 4th floor, room 447. come alone, and if I don't, then you'll continue your investigation, we'll continue monitoring you, and eventually you'll end up somewhere unfortunate. I'd prefer to have a conversation instead." The line went dead. Clara drove to Denver, arriving late that night. She checked into a hotel downtown and didn't sleep. Instead, she spent hours reviewing everything she knew, preparing questions, trying to anticipate what Marrow would say. At 9 a.m., she stood outside 1961 Stout Street. The building looked like any other federal office. Grey concrete, minimal windows, a bored security guard at the front desk. She showed her ID, stated she had an appointment on the 4th floor, and was waved through without question. The elevator opened onto a quiet hallway. Room 447 was at the end, unmarked except for the number. Clara knocked. "Come in." The room was small, furnished with a metal desk, 2 chairs, and nothing else. No computer, no phone, no files. Agent D. Marrow sat behind the desk. He was perhaps 50, with greying hair and glasses, dressed in a plain grey suit. He looked like an accountant. "Miss Rains." "Please sit." Clara took the chair opposite him. "You're Department 7. I represent the organisational structure currently designated as such. Though, as I mentioned, the designation is temporary. Next quarter will likely operate under a different budget code, embedded within a different parent agency. Why the shell game? Accountability is complicated when your mission involves information control. We exist in the gaps between agencies. Sometimes we're DOE responding to radiological incidents. Sometimes we're USGS investigating seismic anomalies. Sometimes we're CDC handling contagious cognitive phenomena. The designation changes. The work remains the same. Contagious cognitive phenomena? Marrow folded his hands on the desk. Reality is more fragile than most people understand. Occasionally events occur that contradict accepted physics. Not alien invasions or supernatural occurrences, just anomalies, time distortions, energy blooms that don't match any known source, mass hallucinations with no chemical basis. These events create cognitive dissonance. If left unaddressed, they spread. People talk. Stories grow. Belief systems fracture. So you erase the evidence? We contextualize it. We provide plausible explanations that maintain social cohesion. A meteor becomes a weather phenomenon. A mass hallucination becomes contaminated water. Missing time becomes hypothermia. We're not hiding the truth. We're preventing chaos. Clara leaned forward. You're rewriting reality. We're maintaining consensus. There's a difference. Is there? Marrow opened a desk drawer and removed a folder. He placed it in front of Clara. Before we continue, I want to show you something. She opened the folder. Inside was a photograph. Herself, maybe 9 years old, standing in front of a suburban house. Behind her, partially visible in the background, was a black SUV with a circular badge on the door. What is this? North Carolina, 2003. Your neighbourhood experienced localised temporal distortion. 17 families reported identical dreams. Clocks ran backward for 40 minutes, and your father called 911 claiming he'd lived the same Tuesday twice. We responded. We cleaned up, and we ensured no one remembered clearly enough to spread the story. Clara stared at the photo. She had no memory of this, but she remembered that house, that year, and she remembered her father acting strangely for weeks afterward. You did something to my father. We offered him a choice, the same choice I'm offering you now. Which is? Marrow retrieved another folder. Department 7 is always looking for analysts, people who can see patterns others miss, people who are already compromised, who've seen too much to go back to normal life. You're exactly the kind of person we need. You want me to join you. I want to offer you a future. You can't unknow what you've discovered. You can't publish it. No one would believe you, and we'd intervene before any story gained traction. You can't run. We'll find you. You can't hide. You already live in our database. But you can be useful. You can help us maintain stability. You can be part of the solution instead of a problem to be solved. And if I refuse? Marrow's expression didn't change. We have a process for that. Neural interference technology, derived from DARPA's cognitive security research. It's not mind control. It's more like data reconciliation. We can't erase specific memories, but we can make them feel unimportant, like a dream you can't quite remember. Within a week, you'd lose interest in this investigation. You'd move on, get a new job, maybe relocate, live a normal life. You'd lobotomize me. We'd help you forget an obsession that's destroying your life. Many people find it merciful. Clara stood. Her chair scraped against the floor. I need time to think. Of course. Take 24 hours. I'll be here tomorrow, same time. Come back with your decision or don't come back at all. Either way, the outcome is already determined. She walked out without responding. Clara spent the day driving aimlessly through Denver, trying to process what Marrow had told her. Every option led to the same place. Department 7 controlled the outcome. Join them or forget them. Comply or be erased. There was no third path. She thought about her father. Had he been given the same choice? Had he accepted the erasure, traded his memories for peace? She called her parents that evening. Clara, honey, is everything okay? Her mother sounded worried. I'm fine. Is Dad there? He's in the garage. Hold on. Her father's voice came on the line, warm and familiar. Hey kiddo, what's up? Dad, do you remember anything strange happening when I was 9? In North Carolina? A long pause. Strange how? I don't know, just anything unusual, around the neighbourhood. Can't think of anything. Why? No reason, just something I was trying to remember. They talked for a few more minutes. Superficial conversation before Clara hung up. Her father remembered nothing. Either the Department 7 had been thorough, or he'd chosen to forget. That night, Clara sat in her hotel room with her laptop staring at the empty folders where her evidence had been. She could walk away, accept the erasure, wake up in a week with no memory of Department 7, no obsession with patterns, no fear of unmarked vehicles, a normal life, or she could join them, become part of the system that erased truth, help maintain the comfortable lie that kept society stable. Neither option felt like freedom. At midnight she made her decision. She didn't go back to room 447 the next morning. Instead, she drove to the airport and bought a ticket to Seattle. She turned off her phone, paid cash for everything, and tried to disappear into the crowd. For 3 days, it worked. She stayed in cheap motels, avoided cameras, moved constantly. But on the 4th day, she woke up in a Portland motel room and knew immediately that something was wrong. The room felt different. Her belongings were arranged slightly differently than she'd left them. Her laptop was closed, she'd left it open. She tried to turn it on. Dead battery, though. She'd charged it overnight. Clara grabbed her bag and headed for the door. In the parking lot, her rental car was gone. In its place, a taxi sat with its engine running. The driver rolled down the window. Miss Rains, I'm here to take you to the airport. I didn't call a taxi. I know, please get in. Clara ran. She made it 2 blocks before exhaustion overtook her. She collapsed on a park bench, gasping, and realised she couldn't remember when she'd last eaten. How long had she been running? 3 days? 4? The taxi pulled up beside her. The driver got out. Not a driver. Agent Marrow, wearing casual clothes, looking concerned. You chose the hard way, he said. Most people do. Clara woke up in a white room. Not a hospital. There were no medical instruments, no monitors. Just a bed, a chair, a small table. The door had no handle on the inside. Marrow entered an hour later, carrying a paper cup of coffee. How are you feeling? Clara said nothing. You've been here for 2 days. We've been monitoring your vitals, making sure you're healthy. No one's hurt you. Where am I? A federal medical facility, location classified. You're not a prisoner, Clara. You're a patient receiving treatment for acute stress disorder. I don't have a stress disorder. Your behaviour suggests otherwise. 3 days of paranoid flight, irregular sleeping patterns, signs of psychosis. It's all documented. He set down the coffee. This is what I was trying to avoid. You made it harder than it needed to be. What did you do to me? We initiated the reconciliation process. It takes about a week. Your memories of the Department 7 aren't gone. They're just becoming less important. like background noise. Soon you won't care about any of this. Clara tried to focus, but her thoughts felt slippery. She could remember Thornton, the photographs, Crowley's trailer, but the urgency was fading. Why had she been so obsessed? It seemed distant now, unimportant. Fight it, she whispered to herself. Don't, Marrow said gently. It's easier if you let go. Over the next 3 days, Clara's grip on her investigation weakened. She could recall facts, but couldn't summon the drive to care. Department 7 existed. So what? Lots of classified programs existed. Why had she thought it mattered? On the 6th day, Marrow visited again. We're releasing you tomorrow. You'll have a new job waiting, data analysis for a private firm in Austin. Good pay, benefits, fresh start. Your apartment in Arlington has been cleared out. Your parents have been told you're relocating for work. Everything's arranged. What about my files? My research? Gone. We've removed every trace. It never happened. Clara nodded. That seemed reasonable. But that night, alone in the white room, a fragment of memory surfaced. Her father, speaking to her when she was 9. Sometimes you have to remember things even when people tell you to forget. Pattern recognition isn't just about what you see, it's about what you hold on to. Had he said that? Or was she imagining it? She closed her eyes and tried to visualize her evidence. The 3 incidents. ENV071-KD, the badge numbers 7-13-4, the man waving at her in Thornton, the email, "You're very good at this." By morning the details had faded to impressions, but something remained. A feeling that she'd discovered something important. Clara was released on a Tuesday morning. They returned her belongings, her phone, her wallet, her clothes. Her laptop was gone, replaced with a new one. They gave her a plane ticket to Austin and an employment packet for her new job. She arrived in Austin that afternoon. Her new apartment was furnished, her name already on the mailbox. Her employer, a tech firm she'd never heard of, welcomed her enthusiastically. Her new supervisor explained her role, analysing market trends, nothing classified, nothing complicated. For 2 weeks Clara lived normally. She worked, grocery shopped, watched television. Sometimes she'd catch herself staring at nothing, feeling like she'd forgotten something important, but the feeling always passed. Then, one evening, she received an email. The sender was listed as Federal Records Archive. The subject line, FOIA request reminder. She opened it. Your request for records regarding incident ENV071KD remains pending. Estimated processing time 6 to 8 months. You will be notified when documents are available. Clara stared at the email. ENV071KD. The code meant nothing to her. She didn't remember filing any FOIA request. She should delete it. Instead, she searched her deleted emails, found nothing. Searched her browser history, nothing. But the code stuck in her mind. ENV071KD. She opened a private browser window and typed it in. No results, just like before. Before when? Clara closed her laptop and went to bed, but she didn't sleep. 3 months later, a junior analyst at NOAA named David Park was processing routine satellite data when his system flagged an anomalous file. Department 7 event rains .log. He clicked it. Inside were coordinates, timestamps and incident codes. One entry caught his attention. A predicted meteor sighting in rural Wyoming, scheduled for 3 days from now. David frowned. Predicted meteor sightings weren't part of NOAA's standard data. He checked the file's metadata. Created 3 months ago. Last modified yesterday. He tried to trace the file's origin, but the access logs instantly deleted themselves. David should have reported it to his supervisor. Should have followed proper protocol for unexplained data. Instead, he wrote down the coordinates. 3 days later, he took a personal day and drove to Wyoming. He arrived at the coordinates just after sunset and parked on a hilltop overlooking empty grassland. At 9:47 p.m, lights appeared in the sky. Vertical pillars, just like the file had predicted. At 10:15 p.m, 3 black SUVs arrived and parked in the field below. David grabbed his camera and started taking photos. One of the figures looked up toward his position. Even in darkness, David felt seen. The figure raised one hand and waved. Clara sat in her Austin apartment, unable to shake the feeling that she'd forgotten something crucial. She'd started keeping a journal, writing down fragments of dreams that felt like memories, codes, numbers. A man in a grey suit offering her a choice. None of it made sense. But she'd learned to trust patterns even when she couldn't remember why. She opened her laptop and typed, Department 7. No results. She tried. ENV071KD, nothing, but her hands kept typing almost automatically. Department 7 _event _rains.log, and somewhere in a classified server farm in Virginia, an automated alert triggered. A file had been accessed. Not by Clara Rains. Her credentials had been deactivated months ago, but the search query had been logged. Agent DiMauro received the notification on his secure phone. He read it, sighed, and opened a new case file. Subject: Rains Clara. Status: Recursive Awareness. Recommendation: Enhanced Reconciliation. He closed the file and made a call. "We have a problem," he said. "The Rains case isn't resolved." She's starting to remember. "How is that possible?" "I don't know, but we need to bring her back in." "What about the other one?" "Park." "Same protocol. They're both exhibiting pattern recognition despite treatment. It's as if the signal is calling to them." "Then we need to find the source of the signal." Marrow looked out his office window at the Denver skyline. "We've been trying for 70 years. Whatever creates these events doesn't want to be found. It wants to be seen, and it chooses who sees it." He hung up and pulled up Clara's file again. Her photo stared back at him from the screen. Taken at age 9, standing in front of a suburban house, a Department 7 vehicle visible in the background. Even then she'd been watching. Some patterns couldn't be erased. Some people couldn't forget. And somewhere in the American night another set of lights appeared in the sky, calling to those who could see. Department 7 would respond. They always did. But the pattern would continue. It always did.